Hello everybody and good day, whichever part of the world you're from. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And thank you for joining us on Table Talk, a series of conversations about food and topics adjacent to food. My guest today is Krish Ashok. Ashok I've known for a fairly long time on Twitter, and I've known him as a musician who I followed. Every time he would put out music, I would go listen to his music. And I discovered over time that he plays multiple instruments, though I believe the violin was his primary instrument as a young man, as a child. And then discovered that he also cooks, that he does art. And then last year he did a book. And we're going to talk about all those things. And Ashok, thank you so much for joining us on Table Talk.
Hey, Peter, absolute pleasure.
Right. So I thought we'd start out by this is something I ask everyone who's on Table Talk. Tell me about your early relationship with kitchens and food and cooking. What are your earliest memories of these things? There's this little time where, as children, we eat what is put in our mouths. And then along the way, we start learning that food is prepared. It has to be bought or you go out to get it. It doesn't just appear magically. And so sort of take us through that realization of what your earliest memories of kitchens were to this thing about learning that food exists as more than this thing that just appears in front of you and that you have to eat.
So my earliest memories of food were nothing unique or interesting in the sense that it was one of those typical ultra orthodox Tamil Brahmin families that I grew up in. At that time, the only reason I've had a relatively more interesting path in life is because my mother's side of the family and father's side of the family were diametrically opposite when it came to conservatism. My mother came from a very, very orthodox, ultra-orthodox family. She even right now does not eat onion or garlic or mushroom and so on, in addition to being vegetarian. And my father's side of the family came from a slightly different a bunch of people who were entrepreneurs who were not into the usual professions that people tended to be from that community, and having sort of gone through failures in business and so on kind of changes people. I think they had a different outlook. They had a more broader outlook. They had lived and worked in other cities in India, and so my father's approach was always that eat whatever your mother cooks at home, but whatever you can outside. And when I mean whatever you can, literally anything, right? Don't come and tell us what you've eaten, but make sure you do, so that you don't become one of those people who's very restricted in terms of what you can eat. And again, his experiences were shaped by his travels abroad when he was a young man, and he struggled to adapt. Not too many Indian restaurants, say in Germany or Switzerland in the 1970s. And so he was like, no, I think you need to learn to eat everything. I'm not going to force you to make all of these things, but you make sure that you eat outside. So those were the broad influences. And I think most of the cooking, in some sense, as it tends to be in most Indian kitchens, is the mother. And so therefore, so it was entirely vegetarian, and it was, in fact, there was no garlic at home. Onion was not there on, say, specific days of the week when there was a puja or something like that. And then it was, and my grandmother, for example, my maternal grandmother, did not even allow male children to come into the kitchen, in that this is not the place for children and so on. And so that's a sort of milieu that I kind of grew up in. But it is only because we kind of kept traveling around India. I mean, we lived in Chennai, Bangalore, and Delhi, and Mumbai, and everywhere else. So I had this unique opportunity of taking to school a tiffin box filled with idli or dosa or upma or semolina or one of those quick fire South Indian breakfasts that working South Indian women tend to make, right? They tend to be very, you can prepare ahead of time and you can put it together very rapidly. It's not like an aloo paratha, that takes a tremendous amount of individual effort to make, and so on, right? So, and my schoolmates would say, I want to eat dosa, so I'll give you my aloo paratha and methi paratha and so on. So funnily enough, a lot of my comfort food ended up, even right now, it's actually mostly North Indian food, because I grew up eating at school. Most of my lunches were methi paratha and aloo paratha and buli paratha and those kinds of things, rather than the South Indian sort of food that used to be made at home. So in that sense, I have a fondness for North Indian food because of the nostalgia that's associated with it, and the flavors. Therefore, I developed a taste for those flavors in a way. It's interesting because my grandmothers, for example, uh, they had a sort of a very strict Ayurvedic sort of idea of what ingredients to use in what dish and what to not use. And for them, certain things were what they call masala, meaning that if it's not coriander, cumin, chilies, or fenugreek, any other spice is either a special occasion thing or will arouse passions, if you will, right? So those used to be called masalas. Okay, so garam masala was a strict no, and in that they would just simply not use. And for example, certain spices like soft, star anise, and so on, are strictly not allowed at all, right? I mean, they were like that ultra orthodox. I don't know if people have heard of it, but that's how strict they were, right? But then I kind of got used to those flavors from the fact that they were used liberally in North Indian cooking, which is funny because all those spices actually grow in South India, far more commonly used in North Indian cooking than they are in the average South Indian cooking, which tends to be focused on just coriander, cumin, chilies, garlic, curry leaves, and so on. The fancy spices being only for special occasion. But garam masala is literally in every dish that you sometimes make, and so on. So those were some of my early memories, at least of someone eating. Right. My experience in the kitchen obviously started much later as a teenager, because my mother was working, and at some point, and she had 3 boys. So as you might imagine, she was exceedingly tired all the time. So she essentially said, okay, I need to teach one of these guys. And I need to pick the one person who's least likely to not cause an LPG explosion in the house. And so I was the eldest. So she picked me and said, I'll teach sambar and rice, so that if I'm traveling, you just make this, you just need to make rice, make sambar, and that's it. Curd is always there. You can buy curd from Mother Dairy, in Delhi back in the day. So, you don't have to worry about fermenting and milk and all of that. Just, deal with that, right? And she taught my father how to make coffee, because, we all needed coffee three times a day. So my father was the coffee person and I was the lunch person, if you will. And that's how I started cooking when I was about 13 or 14. So every time my mother would travel, that's when I would cook.
So it's a good thing your grandma wasn't around in that household, because she wouldn't have wanted that at all, right?
So my paternal grandmother was she was a very different breed, and she had sort of she grew up basically feeding about 30 or 40 people in her household, and so in fact her what should I say, cooking skills were restricted to feeding 40 or 50 people. Mm-hmm. So she would almost always put too much salt or too much of most things when cooking for 2 or 3 people. So my mother largely just handled the kitchen, and so she would just sit and read books. And so she was a very liberal, ultra liberal sort of person. So yeah, so she didn't really care. Yeah.
So in these travels around India, you said that things other than what were actually home food for someone who would say been born in Chennai became your comfort foods. And what did it occur to you at that point in time to also learn to cook those things? Mom was telling you how to make your rice and sambar. Yeah. But beyond that, when did you start expanding your repertoire, trying to learn how to cook other stuff?
Oh, so not till I joined the company that I now work for and went abroad is really when I genuinely started experimenting, to be honest. Because I think when you learn cooking, and especially when you learn cooking in an orthodox household, things that you're not supposed to do is 10 times larger than the number of things you need to do, right? So it's like, you do not use this vessel for this. And once you use this vessel for this, you will wash it and only then use it again. You will not touch this ladle with that. So the number of rules. And again, it's like, she was taught this by her grandmother, and she believed that these were all important, right? And that and they were part and parcel of the cooking process. So the entire pedagogy of cooking, at least, was focused on what you're not supposed to do as opposed to what you're supposed to do, right? And exceedingly concerned that I must not use garlic, that I must not use these ingredients, that egg must not be cooked, and so on. And my father actually encouraged for us to get protein. He ultimately convinced my mother that he will make it, and he had a separate pan. And my mother was worried that we would mix the pans and we would make the dosa on the egg pan, and that would completely sort of blow her, sort of completely violate a lot of rules that she held sacred, and so on. So I kind of grew up, and again, it's interesting. So when you learn something, and I've seen this in music as well, right? In the early days, neither the teacher nor the student are keen on experimentation. Actually, even if the student is keen on experimentation, the teacher will say, no, just make sure that you get the basics right. You can experiment later. I mean, a good teacher will say that. A bad teacher will simply say, no, all of that is wrong. You only do this, right? It's essentially what ends up happening. And in some sense, I think, I just stuck to, I don't think I made anything other than sambar, rasam, and potato fry, to be honest, right? When my mother was there, she would cook healthier vegetables. But when she was not there, it would be an opportunity for us to cook potatoes every day, right? So why not? And so that was, so experimentation really started only when I was literally managing my own kitchen, right? My roommates did not cook one bit. And so they literally said, look, we will wash dishes. We will come with you to the grocery store and carry and share the grocery expenses, but you cook. And then that's essentially, that's when I really started experimenting. And that's when I started talking to other relatives, documenting recipes. And in some sense, the seed for Masala Lab was born back then, because I realized that all the really great cooks didn't think in terms of recipes. And they use heuristics. And somehow I found that nobody was capturing these heuristics in a book, but everybody is like writing ultra precise recipes. And that's really not how a lot of these older great cooks tended to think.
We'll come back to that in a bit, but I wanted to also look at another aspect of young Ashok, which was the music, right? In a previous conversation, when we were talking for the Girl Project, you'd mentioned that your dad was very keen that you be a violinist, a professional violinist, playing for your money, which evidently, I mean, if he thought you were that good, you've been learning since you were a child. Tell us about that aspect of you as well.
So I started learning the violin when I was 7. I wanted to. I mean, I was briefly curious, apparently, I don't remember these things, but I apparently showed some interest at one of my mother's parties, if you will, a picnic of some kind. And one of her colleagues was a famous violinist who was also a bank employee. Because just music alone wasn't a good enough profession, and so on, and she volunteered to teach me because I showed some interest, and so on. And then after about 1 or 2 classes, I hated the whole thing, and I said, look, I need to stop this because this is just terrible. This is boring, and the instrument sounds terrible, and I have no interest at all. But I think for my mother, it was for her it was natural that the only way to get kids to learn music is to just shove it down their throat. There's just no, and this is non-negotiable. And this is, at least in her family, everyone in my mother's side of the family has learned music, and half of them are professional musicians, either dancers or musicians. Many of the women are either vocalists or dancers, and many of the men are musicians of some kind. But then, not all of them are full-time musicians. And obviously, it's just not possible. But so she came from that kind of a background. And so she said, okay, the only way to teach kids is to force them, right? And again, later in life, I kind of realized that of all instruments to try to learn as a kid, violin is the worst, because you won't like the sound of what you're playing for about, roughly 5 to 6 years. It's not like a guitar. If the guitar is in tune, you can play a couple of chords and learn a song in about a few weeks, right? Or a month, maybe, right? Keyboard, really, as long as the piano is in tune, you hit keys and it sounds nice. A flute, again, you can just blow as long as you sort of, keep your fingers at the right places, and it'll sound okay, as long as you can get the sound out. But a violin will sound atrocious for years because it's a fretless instrument, so you need to build muscle memory. And once you even if you build muscle memory, you're probably still sawing the string, like an electric saw of some kind, and it's really, really nasty sounding. And so, in that sense, I think, retrospectively, I'd say, okay, good that she forced me to do this, because by myself, I would have just given it up. There's no way I was going to spend 5 years trying to learn something and so on. But the moment I kind of got reasonably better at it, and then you kind of say, okay, no, this is good. So maybe now I can listen to a song and play it myself, right? Of course, my Carnatic classical teacher said that's exactly what you're not supposed to do. You will not play film songs on this holy instrument that is meant for Carnatic classical music, notwithstanding the fact that the violin was introduced by the British to Carnatic music only in the early 19th or mid 19th century and so on. But leave that aside. But I think the idea was that there was something special, there was something sacred about Carnatic classical music, and that you must not sully it by playing film songs on it and so on. But pretty early in the day, I realized that there was actually more musical merit in Ilayaraja's music than 99% of the repertoire of Carnatic music. Okay, most of the, it might be controversial, but most of Carnatic music is very pretentious show, with a very restricted, audience belonging to one caste who kind of say aha oho at something that they have no clue why they're saying aha oho to, and they think it's all amazing, right? But at the end of the day, it there is just so much more music out there. I recognize that the genius of Ilayaraja and the genius of other, Western music, and when I learned to play the keyboard in a conservatory when I was in the US, I kind of recognize that its music is so multidimensional. There is melody, there is harmony, there are ragas, and there are modes, and there is so many different kinds of rhythms, and then there is the entire sonic landscape of how you do sound engineering. So it's just such an amazing thing. But as a child, I think I grew up largely just playing the violin for almost 10-15 years. I was semi-professional in the sense that in my teens, I was accompanying Carnatic vocalists. So there's this thing in Carnatic music where the vocalist is central and then the violinist sits by the side and just plays along, right? And you're not supposed to outshine the vocalist. You're supposed to be less creative. So I feel like a very unimaginative vocalist, the violinist is expected to be slightly less imaginative than the vocalist and so on. So that's how the concert format is. And so on. Pretty soon I was sort of starting to get bored of that. But my parents persisted. They made sure that they kept sending me to some of the best teachers in India. The teacher that I learned from finally was a Padma Vibhushan guy named T.N. Krishnan, passed away recently in his 90s. I mean, he was a spectacular teacher. I mean, in the sense that he was a minimalist, someone who just focused on the sound of the violin rather than the flourishes that a lot of Carnatic musicians are known for. The sound of his violin was almost Western classical in how. I mean, I'm pretty sure that is one of his grandfathers learnt Western classical music, and his bowing structures and his bowing style and everything is very, very sort of redolent of that. So that's sort of my musical journey, if you will. But I went abroad. The first thing that I did was started learning other instruments and then experimenting with other genres of music.
What are the other instruments you play? I know you play cello, guitar, and piano, keyboards.
So violin is my primary instrument, and then guitar, and then I would say cello, and then largely again not so much of I play the piano in order to do background music for the music that I put out, rather than play it as a live instrument. So I think a violin is the instrument that I can play comfortably live, to a smaller extent guitar as a rhythm guitarist, not so much as a lead guitarist and so on. And then cello to a small extent. I'm still learning the cello in that sense.
I mean, there's so many threads here that I wanted to pick up, but I've got to keep remembering that people are here to hear more about the book and that. And yes. But I must warn everyone who's in here that this kind of digression is a feature, not a bug, right? This is the kind of conversations I like to have, because what I do try to do here is to get to know the person, not just the work. The topic that we're talking about is an alibi, because I look for interesting people first. Then if they have a specialty that could probably give me something I can put in a headline and for a poster, good. But it's not that, it's that way around, not the other way. So yeah, I mean, there were so many things that you mentioned, even in music, the whole bit about men only doing, largely, you wouldn't find so many men in dance. You would find women as vocalists and as dancers. Men would be instrumentalists, very few female instrumentalists. The fact of the violin being actually an import.
Yep.
Carnatic music actually has been, for all its orthodoxy, rather welcoming of instruments from other parts of the world.
Yeah. The orthodoxy is a forced orthodoxy of the last 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
People sort of say that, and I'm sure, and actually T.M. Krishna says it way better. As a serious legendary practitioner, he says it much better. But ultimately, Carnatic music in its current form is less than 100 years old in its current form. And it didn't invent this kind of classical music. It inherited a rather rich tradition from a Devadasi tradition, and also a tradition of musical castes in Tamil Nadu and in South India. There's a caste of people who play the Nadaswaram, right? The erstwhile chief minister of Tamil Nadu, M. Karunanidhi, comes from a caste of people who play the Nadaswaram. And there are traditional people who who teach dance and so on. And these were not Brahmin communities, right? And the erstwhile temples and the kings, and when they were patrons, this form of music was much more heterogeneously represented, meaning that there were more people practicing it, and there were more styles and substyles, and there wasn't this rigid distinction. This is light music and this is classical music and so on. It was a big spectrum of art and music that was patronized by temples and patronized by kings and so on. I'm not painting this as some great sort of this thing, but purely from the history of this music standpoint, right? It's just that when the British arrived and essentially in a short period of time ended up making this one small community the elite, in the sense they had access to education, so they suddenly became court employees, and they were employees with the British and so on. They became the elites in society, and elites in society need elite forms of art. They ended up picking this, and then they closed the doors and they basically said, "No, this is our music, right? And then only we will perform and only we will listen, right?" And that's how this was born, right? And yeah, I mean, I was born in that sort of tradition, so I kind of have an inside view of this. But that's really what it is.
We'll come back to music later, perhaps, and maybe not in this conversation, but maybe in another one, in another series.
Yeah.
But let's take the other aspect of you, which is the day job, which is engineering, which is working for a fairly long time with a global IT major. I don't know how comfortable you are with mentioning names of employer, but therefore I haven't.
Yeah, I'm okay. I'm quite comfortable. Yeah.
All right. You've been with TCS for in an era when people seem to switch jobs every 2-3 years, you've spent more than 2 decades there.
Yeah.
So how now eventually you had to make a choice, as all of us do at some point. We, as children and as young people in our teens and so on, there are multiple interests, multifarious things that we want to do in various things. And then we wind up, for such is the way of the world, having to choose something that we're going to give a certain amount of our time to. And for many of us, this means the job, right? This is the thing that's going to pay your bills. And 8 hours of your day and more, which is what happens to a lot of young people, and it happens a lot in some kinds of industries as well. Information technology being one of them, sort of valorizes the long hours and all of that kind of thing. But yeah, so the choice that you had to make, you went yet cooking up a storm. You were doing self-defense cooking at home, but you were a proficient musician, good enough to be on stage with other musicians as well. You could have taken that much further. And there was engineering, which was what a good TAM boy should be aspiring to.
Yes.
Right?
Right.
What were your choices as you saw them, and why did you make the choice you did?
Yeah, so at least I don't think it was entirely my choice, to be honest. I think when I was young, so there was an inflection point around my engineering when I was in engineering, when I was studying to be an engineer. So so the other thing was that whether I wanted to become a musician or not, the general prevailing wisdom was you get a degree. It's not like you suddenly just stay at a high school dropout and become a legendary musician. So nobody wants to take that risk, right? So even back in the day, many of the other musicians in my family were all used to be bank employees and usual, work in Steel Authority of India or work for the government and so on. So that was no different in that sense. But around the 3rd or 4th year of my engineering was when my teacher said that maybe you should just skip all of this career business and then start doing music full time, right? You can travel with me, start playing with me, and then that way another 10 years, then you can do this yourself and so on. And actually, when at that point of he was a Padma Shri awardee and all of that, it was a hard offer. It was a hard thing to say no to. But for some reason, my father said, "You know what? I know I've forced you into music, and both of us have forced you into music all these years. And then when you were young, we've made sure that you've had as much exposure, playing live, playing concerts, participating in contests, and doing all of these kinds of things, right? Playing on TV and radio and so on. But at this point, knowing what we know and so on, and knowing fully well how good you are and how good your teacher is, we still think that you should do this on your own terms by having a job, right? You shouldn't we don't want you to stop playing the violin, but we don't want you to not have a job, if you will, right? And so obviously I think in a sense, right? So when you really think about it, I did electronic engineering, right? And there was there was no need for me to necessarily join software, actually, right? I could have joined a Philips or any of the serious electronic manufacturers, as people tend to do, and so on. At least the trend of people just doing whatever engineering and joining IT came much later. uh, at that point of time, at least where I graduated, people were getting good jobs in Lucent and Bell Labs and places like that. So I still chose IT at that point, actually for a very for this reason, saying that, look, if I wanted to continue to spend half my attention on music, I need a job that is relatively easier, if you will, less stressful. And this might come as a surprise, but in 1999, software was the only job that allowed you to have 2 days of the week free. Every other company worked 6 days a week, but software let you take Saturdays and Sundays off, right? So literally, I chose IT simply because they let me have Saturdays and Sundays off. There was no other reason, right? And in a sense, I saw it as the most amount of money for the least amount of effort at that point of time. Okay. And again, this is again in comparison to hard engineering, the hardcore manufacturing and the electronic engineering, and getting into research and perhaps doing a PhD and getting into that, right? This was essentially what it was, and it was just fortunate that I ended up in a role in TCS where, being who I am, I would just simply say, no, I won't do this, or this is just too backbreaking. I will automate this. I won't work 8 or 9 hours a day. I'll automate this in about half the time, and then maybe head home and do something else. And this was something that the company was perfectly fine with, right? And over time, I've had the fortune of having managers who just simply let me be what I am. So in a sense, over time, my heuristic was to apply whatever it is that I learn while I'm doing music or creativity or art, and applying those mental models at work, purely from the point of view of thinking outside the box, coming at it from a fresh perspective, combining things that don't mix. Every one of these heuristics that I apply everywhere, and I think I spoke about it in another interview, that no matter what I do, be it IT or music or cooking, I'm ultimately doing the same set of meta heuristics things, right? Of optimizing, of finding shortcuts, of trying to mix things that don't mix, and then trying out, constantly experimenting, right? So this applies to everything that I do. And it felt to me that that the more number of hobbies I had, I was actually getting better at my job, not worse at it, right? And in that, a good engineer is actually a lazy engineer, in that he automates everything, and he trains other people. A good manager delegates more work and so on. And in that sense, I just that's the reason that I've stuck to one job for almost 22 years now.
So when did the engineer start influencing the cook?
I think I would think much later. So the early days, I was still under the assumption that cooking is an art, and therefore it's mystical, and therefore you have to follow the rules. And if they tell you put this after this, that it is somehow it is important that you have to follow it without asking questions, right? And honestly, despite being someone who's loved chemistry all my life and so on, for the early part of my life, I wasn't necessarily looking at the kitchen through the lens of chemistry at all. I saw it as completely different. It was almost as if, but it's also, I guess, is an unfortunate outcome of how we are taught science in general, right? In that we're taught that science happens only in the chemistry laboratory in test tubes. You don't naturally assume to think that the same thing's happening in the pots and pans and the deep frying and the squeezing of lime. The exact same reactions are happening, but your teachers are not telling you that, right? In fact, one of the things that I did recently during the pandemic for my son's school is to record like a 2-hour video in the school's kitchen during the one of these in between waves, if you will, of explaining high school science, physics, chemistry, and biology, by just pointing to stuff in the kitchen as things were cooking, and the kids loved it, right? And so in that sense, I think the application of engineering and application of basic science, if you will, came about much later. I think after I'd kind of gotten good at it, and then I started naturally experimenting as I used to, and then I realized that what, I can skip this ingredient, it seems to be fine. I can change the order, and it seems to be fine. Then I started documenting these things, and I have notes going back to almost 15 years of everything that I tried, and so on. And so that's why the book didn't take too long to write. So there was just a lot of material that I documented.
Something you say in the book as well, which folks, is Masala Lab, yeah, which available, it launched late last year.
Yeah, December. Yes.
So in the book, you say something which I also wanted to touch upon, which is about music as well in Indian traditions. The lack of notation, of documentation of
Yep.
how something was played was something that was absent in Indian music by and large.
Yep. Yep.
It's Western music allowing for the fact of, say, different uh, eras in what was available and not being able to reproduce the exact instruments or whatever. You can sit down and play something that, say,
Yeah.
Liszt was playing in the way that Liszt played it, because that is
Yeah.
documented. You may
Yes.
not have the finger size to be able to
Yeah.
pull it off, but
Yeah.
by and large, it is technically possible for you to play it exactly like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which does, that thing. So this lack of documentation, why do you think that has happened in music, in cooking, and so many other aspects of our life? So much is just handed down. Uh, Kurush Dalal, I don't know if he's here, who is archaeologist
Yeah, I
and
know. Good friend. Yes.
yeah, and anthropologist and a whole lot of other things, aside from being a caterer. Was talking about how the way that in Indian homes, it's like you sort of go through an undergrad level of cooking where you're learning from the senior women in your house.
Yes.
You go on to grad level cooking when you do your own kitchen. And your post grad is when you have now handed over to your daughter-in-law. And influencing. So every one of us keeps learning new traditions each time there is this, even if both say are from exactly very similar backgrounds,
Yeah.
similar cultural and religious and whatnot backgrounds, there would still be nuances in the way your mother and her mother made a sambar, right? And what would rule
Yes.
and things like
Yep.
that. Minor things, family stuff to way from.
Yeah.
Yeah, but let's just talk a bit about this documentation scene. Why is it that you think that we haven't documented such an important part of our lives?
It's rather unique. It's rather unique to this part of the world. And well, absolutely, Kurush will be able to tell you the history in far more detail. But at the very least, it seems to have started sometime after the decline of the Indus Valley, because it looks like, we don't know because we haven't deciphered the Indus Valley script. The Indus Valley was, I mean, phenomenally more advanced than whatever came afterwards. Okay? Actually, Indus Valley was an urban civilization, and then what came later was a rural civilization. And then, we are, in some sense, we have inherited from that rural civilization rather than the urban civilization. We don't know why they disappeared. I think it's climate change. We don't know quite yet, right? So many theories and so on. So interestingly enough, there is a the people who came after the Indus Valley were not a writing things down people. They were very much an oral tradition people. The Sanskrit, for instance, was never written down for thousands of years. I mean, it's astonishing that this language survived this long without being written, strictly through an oral tradition. Now, so there are two things. Historically, if you look at sort of meta history, oral traditions have certain advantages and certain disadvantages. They have advantages in that they are interpretative, in that every time someone tells you something, the lack of fidelity can sometimes be a feature, not a bug, in the sense that you can interpret it, particularly with regard to mythologies, with regard to religion and so on. It's not like by the book. There is interpretativeness. And so in some sense, if you look at the history of religion in this part of the world, you'll find that it kind of grew by one mythology, including somebody else's gods in their mythology, and then now you become one religion, right? So, for example, the Vedas don't talk about Vishnu or Shiva or any of the gods that came later. They included local gods, and as they came south, they included Ayyappa, they included Muruga, and so Muruga suddenly was inducted as the second son of Shiva. So there is that agglutinative sort of sense that is not possible if you go by the book, right? If you then you can't change, right? It's very hard to edit books, religious books at least, right? And as we've seen from monotheistic religions, right? So, but at the same time, it comes with its flip side. So when you combine that with the caste system and so on, the oral traditions make it easy for you to contain and restrict knowledge to whoever you choose to transmit it to. So the moment you write things down, it becomes democratically available to, well, anyone, right? So that's the whole, the reason the printing press changed the world is because, you couldn't hoard your knowledge. Once it came down, then you have no control over who has it, right? And that's the thing, right? So it allowed you to therefore pass down knowledge very selectively, right? And in India we have that religion that, okay, this is knowledge that only this person has this knowledge, he'll only pass it down to people of his caste, and this person only these people are supposed to speak Sanskrit, only these people are supposed to play Carnatic music. So you see that sort of habit continuing forward. The other aspect, particularly with cooking, is that I was reading Lizzie Collingham as well as Katie Achaya, and one of the things they often say is that in India, cooking has always been seen as an adjunct to health and medicine, not so much as an art or something that's it. It's supposed to be, you're supposed to pay constant attention to whether you're supposed to eat this on this day, whether you are supposed to eat it, whether you can feed someone else, can you eat what somebody else gave you, caste related rules, and whether you can eat garlic on this day, and so on, and Ayurvedic principles and what to eat when, and so on, as opposed to thinking of that. And the other interesting thing is that there is no culture of commensal eating also. So it's actually quite interesting that in Hindu communities there is no concept of commensal eating. Okay, so you're only supposed to eat with your family. So in fact, even with your family, men don't eat with women, right? Women eat later, and so on. Commensal eating is eating with the community, right? Having a feast, eating together. Is not a concept because of caste related taboos. You're not supposed to eat this, you're not supposed to eat this, and so on. Which is why India didn't have restaurants literally till the 1950s. Okay, so the only places that had anything remotely resembling restaurants were used to be there within the Muslim parts of Mughal India, and so on. And they're the ones who have like things like communal bakeries. Like, for example, you make the side dish, but you can go to a baker and just simply get the bread, right? Wouldn't happen in a Hindu household because you don't know the caste of the person baking, all those issues in the past, right? So a lot of the explosion in food culture in India is literally just post-independence, the last 50 years. And it's remarkable how much we have changed. And again, it's a testament to the fact that it's an oral tradition, so it's easy to change also. So that's also there. But the other element to this is that women historically literacy. So, and if home cooking is something, it's tacit wisdom from grandmother to mother to daughter, and to mother-in-law to daughter-in-law, and so on. It's entirely completely oral if they've not had access to education till literally, I guess, one or two generations ago, right? I mean, it's just, I mean, there is literally just one or two cookbooks, if you will, right? And they're terrible in that they don't actually have recipes. Okay, they don't describe how to cook anything. They just tell you what ingredients are, and that's about it. The Manasolasa, the Loka Paraka. There's a bunch of these older Sanskrit texts. So literally you'd have to come to the post 20th century to find the first time somebody's actually written down recipes. And in fact, the first generation of people even writing them down were Anglo-Indians, who started writing them down so that it's easy for them to replicate them in England, right? So, and so on. So it is the first generations of cookbooks were also published by Anglo-Indians, and so on. So it is, so this not writing stuff down is endemic to this part of the world.
Mm-hmm. But you decided to write things down. So let's get to the book and why you decided to do the book. I know you explain it, and people who are coming here because they've read the book, this will be going over ground that has been covered, but there are many people here who may not have bought the book so far. So could we go in a little bit into that? Why did you decide to do the book? What pushed you into doing it, and how did you go about actually putting it together, given that you lead this busy life? You are a global head of a business in TCS, you make music, you cook every day, which is not trivial in terms of time. Fine, the only thing you're not doing right now is commuting and spending parts of your life in airplanes. But the rest is pretty much the same. And just the commuting time alone is not going to account for being able to put a book out. But so why, and then how did you go about writing this book?
So I've always been into creative writing of various kinds. I mean, originally it was largely during my school engineering and early internet days. It was about humor writing. It was mostly around social commentary. So I sort of used to have a blog called Doing Jalsa and Showing Jilpa, which was reasonably popular, at least among South Indians and so on. And that is so that was my style of writing was sort of tongue-in-cheek social commentary with nerdy technology references, right, which targeted at the nerd audience, if you will, right? So that was the sort of writing that I was comfortable doing for the most part. And at some point of time, as I then started writing for newspapers and columnists, because the blog got some attention. So there was a point of time when newspapers would simply ask bloggers to write newspaper columns and so on. So there was that point of time, right? Amit Verma, me, and Sid, and many of those others, right? And then at that point, clearly, the tongue-in-cheek stuff was fine, but newspapers were like, we also need you to write on a specific subject, so you have to keep the jokes down to like a minimum. It's not, you don't have 3,000 words, you only have 600 words and so on. So I had to build a muscle to start communicating science in a dead simple way. So I kind of realized that I had a knack for explaining science in simple first principles way, for no reason other than the fact that that's how I grew up learning it. I have terrible memory, and so I hated memorizing things. And so the only way I could understand things in school was to somehow break it down into absolute first principles, so that remember the first principles and then go derive everything from scratch every time I needed to remember something. There's no way I could have just memorized a couple of paragraphs from the textbook to crack an exam. So I had to derive everything from first principles. So it was just a habit that I carried forward. And so I built that sort of muscle, right? When in fact Penguin first approached me to write a book, it was actually 5 years ago. And they said, hey, why don't you send us a proposal and so on. And back then, I had this sort of, typical arrogant tech bro, techno utopian idea that somehow books were dead, and that the future is all social media. It'll all be blog. It'll be interactive books. It'll be self-published Kindle, and it'll have animations. It'll be interactive. I'll do those kinds of things, but I won't write any dead tree traditional stuff. I'll do something unique. My typical sort of arrogant self back then, 5 years ago.
You just took over time. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, but my ideas have changed. I mean, I am now significantly far more. I have dystopian and pessimistic views about where technology is going, and I'm absolutely. I now buy paper books. I have gone back to buying paper books because I seem to remember more than if I read it on an iPad or some other device and so on. So anyway, so long story short, so that was my first response was what? I mean, I'm not interested. Okay. And then the pandemic hit, and then Penguin got in touch again, said, hey, there's an opportunity. People are going into lockdown. They'll have more free times. Why don't you? It'll be good for you to write a book on something. Why don't you send us a couple of proposals? My first proposal was a cyberpunk science fiction short stories set in South India. Again, very similar to what I used to write on my blog, except, more elaborate short stories, with more edgy storylines and so on, right? And that's the first thing I said. They said, this is good, but can you send us a non-fiction proposal as well? Because during these lockdowns and all that, we don't see people buying fiction as much because they'll all want to learn. Okay, so they'll buy non-fiction. And so popular science is particularly this thing. So why don't you pick something in a popular science category? And the thing was that when I sort of sat down to think, okay, what could I possibly write about, right? I could write about music, but for some reason, it's like I've never been a fan of writing about music. Music is something that you can experience. You can live demonstrate and all that. But words about music, I mean, you'd have to be like an Alex Ross to be able to bring music to life in a way that he does and so on. I didn't think I had the ability to bring music to life or explain it in words. Right? So I said, no, I don't think music is. I could do a podcast, but not a book about it. I could perhaps write about IT or technology and so on. But then, and I have a current job, and to write about anything in that will result in all kinds of conflicts of interest that I might still have and so on. So maybe that's something that I can do, after close to retirement or something, not something that I can do right now, and so on. And then I kind of realized that, okay, should I write maybe a popular science book, maybe explaining popular ideas in science and so on? But then I kind of realized that India has what you call it has this bias towards degrees and and things, prefixing and suffixing your name, right? So you will not be taken seriously as a science writer unless you have like a doctor or a PhD, or you studied at an MIT or somewhere else, or in that field and so on. It doesn't matter. I mean, you may be a terrible English writer, but you still need that sort of degree backing you, because everywhere in India, your first part of your introduction is always where you graduated from. It's completely immaterial to who you've become later in life, but that is still the case. Okay, so that's how it is. And so therefore, I felt that it's strangely enough that the one thing nobody will challenge your credentials for is food, because we all cook. Okay, and I can write about the science of food, right? And that way, and amazingly enough, Nobody's written one. So I'm like, okay, fine, right? So at least nobody's going to question my credentials. I mean, I do cook. I have a social media presence about food, and I'm not writing as a for a restaurant. I'm not writing to train chefs. I'm writing for home cooks, and so win-win, right? So that's why I just, as an afterthought, I sent the proposal for Science of Indian Cooking, and within minutes, Penguin jumped at it and said, "This is the book you need to write." And then, fortunately, I had like 15 years worth of notes and things that I had. It took me about 4 to 6 weeks to write the book.
All right. Just, okay. You had the notes. Yeah. Right.
Yep.
So, yeah. But then again, I mean, yeah, I had a similar discussion to some of this stuff many years ago with a friend of mine who's also an engineer. And we sort of came to this jokey name for it, which we called it object-oriented cooking. All right. Where you sort of learn little processes. So our abbreviation for it was ook, as an object-oriented cooking, and where you learned these small routines that you could then combine in different ways and mix and match and all of that. So when this book came out, I was like, damn, we should have written that book.
Actually, you should have. Yeah, I think a good idea. Actually, yes.
Yeah. So, but but then again, as you were saying, in a culture where things are not documented, where what you learned from your mom, mostly it's women learning from their mothers. It's men don't cook that much even now. Men will get brownie points for doing a barbecue once in 3 months, or for doing that omelette or making that biryani and then leaving the kitchen in a mess.
Yes, but men are professional. Most of the professional chefs are men, not because they're better at it, but because the profession has kept women out of it. I mean, like most professions, right? So no other reason.
Yeah, and of course that's also changing in that you do have celebrated women chefs and entrepreneurs, restaurateurs, and that's changing, and that's beautiful. But yes, so in this point, where you were saying that in a culture where things are not documented, where things are passed down orally by tradition, you learn it from your mother. With all of those things, who would buy a book about cooking the stuff that I would learn from my mother? Who are Penguin and you targeting here?
Yeah. So it's a great question, because we so for example, I think the chapter that took the longest to write was actually the introduction chapter, and in a sense, because we had to grab the reader's attention, so it's your introduction chapter that ultimately expands your reading reading demographic, or narrows it down. So it's a make or break in that sense, right? It's not the blurb, it's not the cover, all of that is fine, right? But ultimately, people read the introduction and then it's okay, am I going to continue or am I going to just give up on it, right? And so on. So originally, when I sat out to write, my natural tendency was to write in a way that caters to nerds and techies and so on, right? People on the internet, savvy people on the urban young guys on the internet, basically, right? So you originally thought maybe we'll target people learning to cook during the pandemic was our first target audience, actually. And typically boys, because they are, on an average, most women in India learn to cook from their mothers, whether they like it or not. Okay, the vast majority of them, at least. Okay, so that was originally our target audience, and then as I wrote the 5th or 6th chapter, I had a chat with Penguin again and said, they actually said, I think we should expand, right? So let's rewrite the introduction, and then let's cut down on some of those very nerdcore technology, science fiction references and all of that. Let's cut down on some of those jokes, because I think we may have something that could end up becoming sort of like a basic manual for anyone. Even if you're a home cook, let's write something that they can pick up to validate the knowledge, the tacit knowledge that they already have. Right? Meaning that, I recently put out a video on like fermentation. You don't need to understand lactobacteria and the science of fermentation to do fermentation. Grandmothers have been doing this for like decades. I mean, for centuries. Okay, and so I don't think that's the thing at all. But if you understand what you're doing, then it expands your horizons. It makes it easy for you to explain to the next generation why you're doing what you're doing, right? Like for example, sometimes my grandmother would put a small stalk of a green chili when fermenting yogurt. Right? Should ask her why she do that. I said, I have no idea. I mean, it works. It gets you thick curd, and that's really just about it, right? And then after tons of research, I figured out that it's because there is additional lactobacteria on the stalks of chilies. Okay. And chili particularly, the funny thing is that the inside of the chili is exceedingly hostile to all bacteria. That's why it's hot, right? The capsaicin is an antimicrobial thing. And that's why we find it hot and so on. It's very, very antimicrobial. So the only part of the chili that is susceptible to bacteria and fungi living on it is the stalk. That's also why if you remove the stalk and store it in your fridge, the chilies will never go bad and so on, right? So that stalk is a fantastic thing to use to ferment anything. Likewise, the skin of ginger as well. Okay. So essentially, now that you understand this, you can apply that knowledge elsewhere. You can actually apply that knowledge. You could even drop it into idli batter. So in case your urad dal bacteria didn't deliver the goods, you could have some additional plan B bacteria, if you will, right? So it's just that this kind of the scientific understanding of tacit knowledge that already existed. Right. And so therefore we decided to expand the audience and said, no, it's a popular science book for everyone. One, if you are a good cook, then it explains why what you do works. Right. And if you know that, it makes you more confident, it makes you experiment more, and it helps you explain things better. If you're a beginner cook, then it's an absolute basic user manual. If you hate cooking, it's a good way to revise high school science using what you see in the kitchen. So we said, okay, let's really just go all out and target a wider audience. I mean, it was a risky thing because they had to decide to print more copies, and if it bombed, I mean, it's the losses are much higher and so on. But fortunately, it did well and so on.
So at a good stage, would you like to read something from the book, perhaps from the introduction or anything else? But I think considering we've just talked about the introduction and how that changed, perhaps something from the introduction to start with.
Yeah, I think I'll maybe read. I think the introduction was pretty much, I think the first couple of paragraphs was essentially what took the longest time to write, to get the crux of, and again, it had to be the first couple of pages. You have to grab the reader or you lose them, right? So cooking, people will tell you, is an art. Indian cooking in particular is supposed to be an art wrapped in Oriental mystique, soaked in exotic history, and deep fried in tradition and culture. Western food is supposed to be scientific and bland, while Indian cooking, we are told, is all about tradition and flavor. Some people innately have a knack for it, and many don't. The Tamil expression kai madam, which literally means hand flavor, is used as a compliment for those who somehow had this arcane knowledge handed down to them. The metaphor also hints at where exactly this knowledge is stored, not the brain, and thus is hard to transfer to another person. The COVID-19 pandemic transformed life as we knew it. The fact that cooking is an essential life skill stares us more intensely in the eye than at any time so far. But learning to cook Indian food, it turns out, is a Byzantine maze with conflicting instructions and pseudoscience. The convenience of being able to Swiggy some amazing butter chicken from a dhaba 5 kilometers away, and the fact that more and more young people are living by themselves in cities which are not their hometowns, means that even if they want to cook, they neither have the time nor the daily access to someone who can mentor them in the way your grandmother learned to cook from an older member in her family. And because we have never bothered to build a standard documented model of underlying cooking methods and the science behind those techniques, a meta model, if you will, Indian cooking continues to be wrongly considered all art and no craft. So in a sense, that was like sort of like it had to really capture the whys of, and hopefully get people interested enough to say, okay, I want to try and see what more is there in the book and so on.
So I don't want to get too much into the specifics of the book so that people will buy it, obviously, but also, let's take a few things. I know that in the Simple Recipes group from which the idea for this series started, and I know you're not on Facebook now, so you haven't seen that, but it was a group that started as a sort of a reaction to the pandemic, mainly for people like me who could just about do 2 or 3 things by following a recipe and a few other things by having learned by screwing up consistently and therefore learning how not to screw up in the future after that. But for instance, I had no idea how to make a number of things or what went into it. And this was a sort of a social way to learn. People were very generous with recipes, with tips, with everything from how to store your vegetables to long-term, longest term stuff and whatnot. There've also been a huge number of debates in that group. And there was this post once, which is something that you touch upon in the book as well, at some length, which was about how we're using the pressure cooker wrong, right? To which another person says, yes, I get this. But when I am doing 40 different things in the house, the whistles are all I need. I need that to be able to work this because I am doing all these other things. I count the whistles and that's it. I'm not going to go back there. But
Yeah.
yes, but can we just go into how, I mean, keeping that in mind, we do know that, yes, there are very valid reasons for using the damn whistles,
Yeah.
however
Yes.
annoying they are. And I mean, the little bit that I knew about pressure cooking from my mom was, yeah, you don't let it whistle. You turn it down, let it go.
Yes.
Why are we using the pressure cooker wrong? For those who haven't read that particular
So
debate.
that's what. So that particular thing, I think one of the things that I had to be very conscious in the book is the tone of the book, which is that if I'm targeting newbies, I can take a tone that's sort of derisive. I can say, hey, this is wrong, it'll be a disaster, etc. But if I'm targeting someone who's actually a fantastic cook, you can't be talking down to them. In most cases, a vast majority of my readers are better cooks than I am. Okay. And so therefore, if I have to somehow convince them that it's not the what you're doing that is wrong, it's the why you're doing it that's wrong. And if you understand the why, you could do other interesting things with it. And I'll explain this, right? So the reason why we do the pressure cooker with whistles is exactly what you mentioned. It's that the pressure cooker is one of those devices that that saw a tremendous adoption in this part of the world, and particularly in South India. Again, rice eating cultures and so on. Because more women started working and going to schools and working in South India before North India. So more working women essentially meant less time in the kitchen. And so any gadget that saves you time, also saves you gas, is fantastic. And the pressure cooker is, numero uno in. So basically a good pressure cooker and a good mixie, a Sumit mixie that used to be the case, were like the quintessential dowry items, if you will, because that is literally what you need to run a kitchen, at least a South Indian kitchen. Okay, and so therefore, and when you see, so pressure cookers have been used for a long time in South India, right? And so clearly, nobody reads instructions. The instructions in the pressure cooker actually say, after one whistle, turn it down and then measure time. Okay, that's what they say. But over time, it's obvious that somebody at home figured out that, you know what, I don't have a watch. If I'm an old lady in the house, chances are in the 1950s, chances are I have to go walk outside. There's one clock somewhere. There may or may not be a clock, but I have to find out the time and then I have to do 5 minutes. All of that, I'd have no time. So I'm going to build a heuristic. He just is able to estimate by the number of whistles. And that's how the heuristic would have begun. And that person would have passed it on to their daughter and so on. And then the more it works, it's likely to get passed on. So that's the important thing, right? It's as Nassim Nicholas Taleb says, that sometimes don't take some poor scientific white paper based on bad sample data and say it's better than some ancient tradition. Okay, because the ancient tradition has one thing going for it, which is it stood the test of time. Okay, if this technique didn't work, somebody would not have passed it on. Okay, and so the whistle method works. Okay, so the only this thing is that suddenly when there is technological change, then it stops working. And then if you don't know why it's not working, then you'll have a few disasters here and there, and you can avoid that. Okay, that's the only thing, right? So if you have a regular gas stove, like most Indian people do, with the same, low, sim, medium, high, those 3 settings, right? If you put a pressure cooker on high, the 3 whistles for rice will always work. And it will always work if it's a small family, because the amount of rice you're using is also going to be small. All that is fine. Okay. Now, the reason we say that if you understand the stop after the first whistle and use time is that is a method that is universally applicable. You can scale it up to any amount of rice and any kind of heating device. It could be a gas flame, or it could be an induction stove. Induction, which increasingly is popular amongst people, at least urban people, because it's less messy, there's no fire, there's no gas, it's cleaner and so on, puts out 50%, heats things 50% faster than your gas flame. Okay, unless you have a restaurant level gas flame, which is big, high intensity, or your home gas flame is simply not strong enough, right? Your induction stove, on the other hand, heats water 50% faster. Okay, so because there's no, it actually just directly induces a current in the steel or cast iron, and which heats itself, right? So there is no transfer of heat at all, right? So what it does is that if you go by whistle, it'll come back to pressure in a shorter amount of time than on the gas flame. And so it will mislead you and you'll get undercooked rice if you use the 3 whistle heuristic on an induction stove. Right. And again, if you have a larger amount of rice, your whistle method will break down again. Right. So that's the sort of reason. We have to sort of draw a very fine line and say that if I have to convince you to change this, I have to explain to you why this will not work in some situations, while also accepting the fact that in most cases, your heuristic is probably fine for your situation, especially if you're doing 40 other things. Whistle is easy to hear, memorable, right? Who's going to start a clock? And then, even right now, I sometimes find it inconvenient. I put the timer on the microwave. So to start the timer and then it'll give a ring and so on. I sometimes don't hear it. And these things happen. Yeah. So that's the way this works.
Well, similar discussion on a different topic. I was ranting about the fact that how in India we use our hazard lights wrong, right? The moment there's a bit of rain, people turn on the hazard lights, which I find incredibly annoying because right. There's rain on my windscreen.
There's less visibility. Yeah.
Refracting, right? Yes. And two, I have no idea what that person in front of me is going to do next because there go the hazard lights. And Amit Verma, fellow blogger and friend and author, fellow in the sense I'm not an author, Krish and Amit are, said that, look, it makes sense if you're in a culture and a certain set of things to follow what goes on there, because otherwise you are the aberration, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
see, the context actually matters, right? So, the driving point, another fantastic example is that like many others, I lived 7 years in the US and then I came back and then all of a sudden I was like, oh, why are people driving like maniacs in India? Because after 7 years of, civilized driving and so on, this just seemed like chaos. And then, then one cab driver actually explained it to me. Yeah. So I asked him that, why is it that you're just changing lanes without looking back? In the US, that's one of the most cardinal sins, right? You have to indicate, you have to look behind, you have to physically turn, and you won't get your license if you do not physically turn behind to see. And first and foremost, he said, if you take your eyes off the front of the road in India, you will die. Okay, and so you don't do that. Number one, because there's just too much chaos. The other thing is the fact he said that the guy behind has a better view of you. He'll adjust. So so therefore it struck me that many of the rules that we come up with are all adapted to the situation that you are in, right? There are no universal good rules of driving or universal good rules of cooking. So that's why, so context matters.
I remember driving in Delhi. I was relieving a friend who was really, really exhausted. And we came up to a signal. It was 11 o'clock in the night. All right, we just went to pick up some food. And I said, come on, I'll drive. You're exhausted. So I drove. And there's a signal and I stopped. And he said, just wait, you're going to stop at the signal. Go to the center of the road. So I obeyed quietly. And I was like, a lane on either side of me. And he said, no, because no one else is going to stop. You need to give the guy who's going to go through the signal at 80 enough space.
Yes.
All right. Otherwise, he's
exactly. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
And a little later, we just going out ahead. A guy flashed his headlights at me.
Yeah.
I moved to the left to let him overtake, and he didn't overtake.
Yeah.
And my friend was telling me he thinks you're fucking with him. The moment he starts to overtake, you're going to turn into the right, and he thinks because no one gives way in Delhi.
Yeah. I honestly, I think if just more people maybe just think a little bit or be empathetic to the context of where someone is coming from, in terms of why they do what they do, we just have a lot less conflict in general.
There's another conversation we've had before publicly, but it's about meat and how we tend to do meat wrong. Do you want to touch upon that a bit?
Yeah. But again, I think I very consciously don't use the term wrong per se. I think the context of it is that, so one is that there's a history. So for a long amount of time, meat stopped being consumed by the elites in society. Okay, so or at least the Brahminical elite, if you will, right? I mean, the kings and royalty still consumed it and so on, and it was always seen as the production of meat was seen as something that people from a lower caste would do and so on. So if you read a lot of the observations of India by outsiders like Megasthenes or Fahian or Huensang and all those other travelers to India, I mean, one common thing that they keep talking about is the fact that anybody who butchered meat or ate meat or produced meat had to be outside the town, outside the gates of the city, if you will, right? And that was and they were considered to be impure, and so on. So there is the historical baggage of how we thought about meat, which is strange because I think the Vedas are just filled with meat sacrifices. Okay, so there is clearly this entire thing happened as a post-Buddhist Jainist sort of influence of vegetarianism becoming sort of elevated. The Vedas are just filled with animal sacrifices. Okay, so that said, so there is that, and the other thing is that being a tropical part of the country that did not have access to refrigeration for till very recently, there is understandably a fear of obviously infection of fungus and so on. Meat more than anything else. It's important to understand that a plant, a vegetable, anything is still living, by the way, till the time you cook it. Okay, so you're killing it only at the time when you are literally putting it into the fire. That's when the cells actually die. A meat is dead when the animal is dead. There is no biological activity going on, and so therefore it has no defense mechanism. So it is therefore far more susceptible to nasty bacteria and fungus that can kill you, right? So people have always been careful about meat, and so many cultures use salt to cure it. They sun dry it, and they have other. They make sausages. Again, the salt preserves bacteria and so on. All of these traditions are there in many other parts of the world. In India, it's funny because we don't actually have meat preservation techniques amongst the upper caste. It exists among Dalits. It exists amongst people for whom is so precious they simply cannot afford to waste it and so on. The upper caste Hindus have always said that you have your any old food is generally considered bad. So which is why fermented food was always considered bad and so on. And so any curing of meat was just simply out of the question. Okay? And so because they didn't have that and they did not have refrigeration and so on, the only way to assure that you will not die from salmonella is to cook the fuck out of it. Okay? Is to take no chances. I cannot have any kind of rare steak or any rare pork chops or anything going on. I just need to make sure it's absolute rubber. And to compensate for that, I have tons of flavor. I have spices. I can create gravies that are so spectacularly flavorful that the meat is simply it might as well be potato. Doesn't really matter. Okay, it is that good. It is that flavorful. It's not like say American or French cooking where somehow if your meat is bad, then the entire dish is a disaster. Not so in India. Your meat could be rubbery. People will often say, the chicken was very good. It was a bit dry, but the gravy was very nice. I mean, it's a very unique thing that people will say in India, that they'll absolutely be okay with the chicken being bone dry. Okay, and it's just that we've kind of gotten used to that. Okay, and so it is just that now that you know better, now that you have refrigeration, now that you have techniques like brining, now that you have every second day there's a new meat startup from starting in India somewhere or the other that deliver fresh meat right to your doorsteps and so on, and people are now starting to get conscious about artisanal cage free and all of that sort of stuff. So now it's time that you perhaps revisit some of those heuristics and see how you can perhaps make your meat more tender and so on. So that's really what it is.
All right. I want to go to one larger question, but I thought in the meanwhile, I asked Krish I keep using Krish and Ashok interchangeably because for a long time I thought Ashok was Krish, and then discovered he had a brother who was also Krish, and then there was Loki.
Yes. So right. So South Indian, a lot of South Indian names are, not all, a lot of South Indian names are patronymic in the sense that they don't have a surname that's a family name that everyone in the family uses. So everyone is either a father's name, your name, or a mother's name, your name.
Which
I know her mother's name. Yeah.
Which I knew because I spent a large part of my childhood in South India. But it somehow just never occurred to me because since you presented it in this way, not with an initial, which a lot of
do. So watching the Olympics, right? And so the Japanese put the surname, right? So they always put the surname. And so people are like, who is Pusarla? Nobody knew that it's actually Pusarla V Sindhu, and they use the last name. So they pick something as the last name because that's the way most of these formats work, right? So
and I mean, multiple cultures have names in different kinds of formats.
Yeah, formats, yes.
The patronymic coming as a middle name, the Ivanovich, whatever it is, like
yes,
Ivan.
My father's was actually, the format was village name, father's name, your name. So your name was the last name. Okay? Mm-hmm. And so he's always had confusion. So people would sometimes call him by his village name. So Gopala Samudram, which you said, like very long. So he absolutely, one good thing he did is got rid of the village name and our names, and he shortened his name down to Krish as opposed to Krishnan, and so he kept our names all under 13 characters.
Yeah, I used to say I find this particularly amusing when foreign publications would attempt to do the full, the name of our former finance minister, Chidambaram, and the full long village name and all that. But yes, that is a genuine full digression here, which was my sort of long-winded apology for sometimes calling you Ashok.
No, that's fine.
Calling you Krish.
No, I've been called Krish, long enough. The running joke my father used to sort of, somebody would call. And then say, can I talk to Krish? And then, he'll go through, okay, which Krish? And so on. My mother used to do the thing of looking at guessing the age of the voice. A more adult voice would be for me, and then a kiddish voice would be for my brothers, and so on. But yeah, so yeah, we're used to this now. Yes.
Well, same thing. I mean, I have an unusual surname and a common first name. And a lot of people just know me by Griff or Griffin and would call my house and say, can I speak to Griffin? And my father would always enjoy having this chuckle and saying, there are 4 of us. Which one would you like?
Yes.
But yeah. But anyway, I asked Ashok if he would play some music for us before we move on to one longer, deeper question that I want to ask and turn it over to the audience as well. So if you have questions, now's the time to start putting them in the Q&A box. Also, let me know in the Q&A box if you would like to come on and ask your question with audio on or even with video on. I'm cool with both. But for now, a little musical interlude.
All right. So let me just let me get set up briefly.
Yep.
A more violin-friendly chair. So I'll move the mic a little bit closer to the amp. So tell me if it's too loud. Yeah.
I think the mic is not picking up the higher notes.
It's not?
Again, I seem to be missing. I mean, when I see the bow moving, I could hear the first bit and then silence.
Oh, is it? Okay.
No, Ashok, there are actually points where I'm hearing the sound of the bow moving, but not hearing the music at all.
Oh, that's strange. Let's check to see. Quite loud here. Or maybe it's just a Zoom trying to do something about it.
Could be. Again, I'm hearing the da 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 and then silence. Ashok, no, a lot of it is not just not carrying. So I guess let's leave this aside then, because we'll take some time to catch up. It seems to be picking up some of the notes. Yeah, it seemed to be fine at that point when we tried out. But here it was like, I could hear the downstroke of the bow and not the upstroke. Again, getting cut off.
Yeah, I think it's some Zoom.
It could be just that.
Thing. Yeah. It's probably what it is.
But yeah, okay, so we won't be able to do that. But let me then go to the question that I did have, which is part of your book title. You say the Science Masala Lab, the Science of Indian Cooking. And
Yes.
what makes something Indian?
Okay. Time for another, I guess, a long way. Just give me 1 second. Let me just switch to the other chair. Okay. So that again is honestly complicated. And so I would often go to when I used to travel, I go to London, and I sometimes would be taken to a Indian restaurant, if you will. And then some guy traveling with me will always make it a point to say, this is not really Indian food, it's Bangladeshi food. Because apparently, most of the restaurants, Indian restaurants, so food that served in the UK was started by Sylheti sailors, because Sylhet is one of those really, really wet parts of Bangladesh. And so a ton of them during the British era ended up becoming sailors who worked on British commercial ships. And for the British, obviously, any kind of low-cost labor from the subcontinent was absolutely fine. They were mostly underpaid, and so the working conditions were so horrible that many of them would just simply jump ship. And they formed a community in England, and they started these curry houses, if you will. And that's the sort of origin of a lot of these. The introduction of Indian food to UK amongst the mass audience, not the posh ones and so on, was by Sylheti, boatmen, sailors, and so on. But the funny thing is that when that happened, most people forget the history that that was part of British India. Last I checked, I mean, it became part of Bangladesh in 1971. Okay, yeah. But food. So in some sense, food transcends politics. Political boundaries. It transcends political events and things like that. I mean, over a longer period of time, there may be impacts of these kinds of things. And so therefore, in that sense, defining Indian food is always a very, very tricky thing. Is Pakistani food Indian food? I mean, I would argue it is. And so, but then people sometimes get upset if I say South Asian food or subcontinental food and so on. They say, why aren't you saying Indian food? It is Akhand Bharat and all of that. But, leave that aside. But the whole idea is that if you had to take this larger region, and I would include Sri Lanka in it, and I would actually even include Burma and Thailand to an extent, although there are there's enough of a variation to say that, okay, this probably is slightly different in that sense, right? And if I had to compare it with, say, something really different, like a Japanese cuisine, for example, right? I would actually say that cuisine of this part of the world is fat and spices based. So that's how I would sort of describe it, meaning that the flavor of a dish, the primary flavor of a dish, is not the ingredient that you put into it, is your choice of spices and the choice of fat that you use that lends the flavor. I mean, as for whether it's potatoes or chicken or mutton or beef or pork, it doesn't matter at all. But it's your choice of spices and the choice of fat that in some sense distinguish regional cuisines in this part of India. So if it is coconut oil and curry leaves and garlic and all of that, it's Malabar, right? If it is sesame oil and fennel and garlic and curry leaves, it's Chettinad, right? And if it's mustard oil and panchforan and so on, it is Bengali, and in that sense, right? So, or another variant of mustard oil and something else with dried ginger, you get a Kashmiri Pandit style of cuisine and so on. So, and likewise in Rajasthan and this part of the world, more ghee centric, ghee plus spices, and Punjabi again is ghee and these kind of whole spices and so on, right? So and that cooking heuristic is, in my opinion, and this is entirely just my personal opinion, that this kind of broadly defines how cooking works. Everything else is secondary. There are many other things, how you prepare the meat, how you cut vegetables, how you do all of that, tadka and all of that. So the concept of tadka, meaning that idea of getting fat full to dissolve the flavors in spice, is literally what defines this part of the cooking. So in that sense, you can actually extend it as far west as parts of Afghanistan into as far east as parts of Burma and so on, right? With, in fact, if anything, Burmese and Thai food, they use wet pastes as opposed to dry spices. That's about the only distinction. Otherwise, they get the wet paste and they dissolve it in fat. That's your primary flavor. But they also have elements of the Chinese style in terms of getting flavor from the meat broths themselves or the seafood broths. So the umami heaviness of that comes through. India is not about umami. So very little, barring, of course, cuisines that do use, say, bone broths and do you cook with a lot of bone heavy meat and so on. The vast majority of cooking is not very umami heavy in this part of the world, right? So if I had to define it that way, I think, that's about the broadest non-controversial definition of Indian food that I can think of.
We have had these long discussions both on Table Talk in the past as well as in person with various friends and on the Simple Recipes group, but this entire thing of authentic, and authentic is always seemed to be more exclusionary than anything else. My way is the way to do it. You get a certain flavor. I mean, as a joke, I made some sago, some tapioca balls, and and I said this is an Italian sago because I used herbs like the kind you would use in Italian food, and I sliced a bit sausage into it and did a little fry up, and it was tasty as anything. But my experiments with dosas. Just today, I put a bit of hot chocolate, mixed it with a little hot water, and mixed it with dosa batter, and they were excellent dosas, right? But I lost one thing there, which I was going to ask you as a result of your answer.
Authenticity you're talking about,
authenticity. So authenticity, and like I said, there are the fractious topics like vegetarianism and what is vegetarian, what is not. There is the oddities within that of things that are mushrooms being considered non-vegetarian by some cultures. Things that grow under the earth are prohibited in some religions. And it's a very fraught topic to get into all of these things. Like, can you, and as a joke, I asked someone, what would be a Jain way of making eggs? And I was ostracized for a little while. My question was really not about, trying to scandalize that person, but what would make eggs Jain cooking is what I wanted to ask.
No, so it's to your actual point that there is a, Bengalis have this thing called niramish cooking, right? So it's usually without onion, garlic. So that's the general idea. And it evolved as something that widows were not allowed to eat onion and garlic. Okay. But they could eat meat. That's the funny thing. So there is an entire cuisine of meat dishes without onion and garlic. So which I always find very funny, but also interesting in a very interesting. So, but at the same time, at the risk of, rather than sort of take this in a frivolous sense, food is very central to people's identity in this part of the world in a way it is not in other parts of the world. We are as much defined granularly at a community level, subcaste, caste level, and so on, by what we eat and what we do not eat. And there's basically just 2,000 years of history of making sure that people do not mix what they eat. And they do not mix as a result of the fact that they eat just different things. And I would actually argue that, if anything, the fact that we are so rigid about what we eat helps sustain those differences, helps sustain the lack of heterogeneity in how people marry outside castes and so on, right? Because, if you can't adjust to someone else's food, it's going to be difficult to sort of live with them and so on. Okay. So at the end of the day, so food is very central to religious and caste identity in this part of community identity in this part of the world. And it's natural that people take it dead seriously. So let's be fair, right? And so therefore, the older a rule is, that harder it becomes to change and so on, regardless of whether it really applies in the modern sense or, whether it has any kind of scientific relevance now. The other interesting thing is that you also have this element that people who talk about authenticity, a vast majority of them are people who never cook. The reason being is that, I think, Krish also says this, and many other people say it, which is that, look, cooking is continuous experimentation. It always has been. People cook with what ingredients they have. Okay? They don't necessarily say, if I don't have all of these ingredients, sorry, sambar is not going to happen. Okay? They don't have tur dal, they will use moong dal. They don't have moong dal, they will use masoor dal. If they don't have tamarind, they'll squeeze a lime juice. people will figure things out. Okay, at the end of the day. So it's always been improvisational in that sense. And the other point, right, that where culinary fusion happens is when people marry into another family, particularly in royal families. Like, for example, a lot of what we now today know as Mughlai food is as a result of fantastic fusion of Persian cooking styles, largely Rajput cooking styles, because the Mughals married a lot into the Rajputs. So the Rajput princesses and queens would bring their chefs with them, and that would sort of fuse with the Persian styles. And today Mughal food does not resemble a Persian food at all. I mean, if you go to Uzbekistan or if you go to that part, that does not taste anything like what Mughlai food does, because Mughlai food is very syncretic. Mughal food is some of the most Indian food you can imagine, because it is truly the marriage of Rajput and Persian cooking styles. And literally that happens in everyone's homes, right? I mean, when somebody from South India marries somebody from North India, you're going to have that kind of fusion that's happening in that kitchen. Idli being served with something slightly more a North Indian gravy, or a dosa being served with chicken curry. I mean, it happens all the time, right? So that is, in some sense, authenticity as an idea in food is a completely stupid and fraudulent idea that only people who do not know the first thing about cooking swear by. Okay, but I can empathize with why they do that, because food is so central to our identities. We take it seriously, right? And so therefore, so it's very natural that anywhere on the internet, if you find someone who's not Indian, or someone who's not from your, group or whatever, making something, first comment will be, this is not how it's made. And I'm sure that guy commenting has never cooked it in his life. Okay, but he'll be like, no, you can never use this with this. You took the example of sago. Astonishingly enough, people will swear by, oh, this is the absolute authentic, original, ancient sabudana recipe from Indore or whatever it is. Boss, first and foremost, sago is of African origin. It was introduced by the Europeans because it grew here and so on. And at some point of time, there was a failure of that crop. So sago went into exceedingly short supply. And by the way, also during the World Wars, the British wanted to use sago as one of their military supplies to all of their armies around the world. And so there was very little left over for the Indian population. So sago was in huge shortage. And guess what happened? A bunch of people in Salem, South India, figured out that they could make sago using tapioca. And that's exactly what we eat today. We think we're eating sago. You're eating tapioca, and you call it sago. So this is hilarious on many levels. An African sort of a grain that was introduced, a starchy thing that was introduced to India, and then went out of supply because the British decided to fight wars with it. Then a South Indian guy in Salem, actually fooling everyone into thinking that, look, here's tapioca, which was also introduced from Africa, by the way. And he made it exactly like sago. And now people eat that and they call it sago. It's actually sabudana. Sabudana is now made from tapioca.
Yeah.
So it is. So what is authentic here?
Yeah, so much else. I mean, one of the answers I get whenever I ask this question about what is Indian is like chilies. And I'm like, dude, chilies didn't grow here. They were brought in.
Yeah. Tomatoes are not.
Didn't grow here.
Rajma. Yeah. Rajma chawal. Yeah, right. Amazingly enough, there's even an argument that, for example, that even Krish says this, that rice actually came to South India much later. And today we are amongst the largest rice eaters, okay, on the planet. But we were mostly millet eaters.
Yes.
Right? Not rice, not wheat, millets. Okay. So,
And I mean, yeah, there is a thing about whether rice originated in the Gangetic belt or China, and there's a constant.
Both. Yeah, correct. Yeah. No, so Bihar and Bengal. Clearly, there is evidence that there was a variety of rice that came there very early, independently. So, but then later we started, there was a crossbreed between the Japonica, which is the Chinese version of rice, and the native version. And that's essentially now what we use is a hybrid in that sense of both. Okay. But rice, if anything, it originated in India, in the eastern part of India, not in the south. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, rather like, the origins of chess, seems to be a constant ping pong thing between China and India. Yeah. Who did it first?
Yeah, correct. Yeah. It's just how does it matter where it started? Right?
Yeah. The thing here about, let's also just get to some of the questions. Richa, would you like to ask your question on audio? I'm cool with reading it out, but I'm inviting you to talk if you want to bring it in.
Thanks so much, Peter. Thank you, Ashok. Hey, so I do have a question. Now, some friends of mine and I have started this monthly thing where we try and learn, different sort of dishes to prepare. So one of my friends did Japanese cooking thing for all of us, and we not really learned, but well, anyway, we had a great meal. Today, I am having them over for Eastern UP food. Now,
Yeah.
I'm a bit tired, and what I do mess up on sometimes, it's a bit hit and miss, is scaling quantities. Because I typically cook for 2.5 people. I have an 8-year-old. So what I'm doing is just like, I don't even know what I'm doing. I'm just sort of going through the fridge because I've been lazy and not shopped. So I found like 2 eggplants. There is a little bit of bhindi. There is moong dal. I know I'm doing moong dal and aloo puri and rice.
Yeah.
But do you have any tips for, how to scale up? I don't measure. I generally just toss in whatever is available. It usually turns out all right. But do you have any tips on scaling up?
No, I think so. Unfortunately, I think if you a lot of the muscle memory that we build ends up working only for the small quantities that we are used to making all the time. And so normally muscle memory fails if you try and scale, and we're not actually natural multipliers, if you will, in the sense that. So it's always good to, which is why I know it's painful, but I learned pretty early that have a good sense of weights, in the sense that at least for how I cook, I might actually not use a measuring scale when I'm actually cooking on a day-to-day basis, but at least once or twice, I make sure that I'm weighing ingredients so that I know that when it turned out fine, that these were the approximate the measures that I used, right? And so in general, if you're following a recipe, for instance, you can just linearly scale all ingredients with a few exceptions. So for example, salt, oil, and all these things scale linearly, right? So if it says, if you're reading a trusted recipe site and it sort of says, hey, by the way, you can do this, say this aloo sabji or something, and you use say 400 grams of aloo, and then you for 4 people, then you can just simply scale it to say 800 or a kg, 1 kg of aloo, and so on. So appropriately, you multiply everything by 2.5, and you should be fine for most things. Only things where scaling linearly does not work is in baking. For example, yeast, you just simply don't scale. You big amount of yeast because yeast reproduces. So you just need to give it more time rather than add more yeast. So that's one. The other thing that does not scale is that if you add water to rice, you're making any pulao or any rice-based thing, the water does not scale. Because which is why I write in my book that how you estimate water for rice is, regardless of the quantity of rice, it's just one finger joint above the surface of the rice rather than actually cups of water. If you do cups of water, it will fail for the most part. But for most part, scaling often is a problem because of the vessels you have and the heat sources you have, rather than the proportions of things you add. Because in Indian food, you can always adjust. Okay, you can always add salt at the end. You can add some more masalas at the end, and you can do a tadka. There are those kinds of adjustments available. But texture, for instance, like if you want a certain kind of texture, and if you have a large quantity, you won't get grilling. You'll actually get steaming. So most things will be unevenly steamed, and so on. So that is often a problem, which is why people cooking for large numbers of people have specialized equipment. Those are giant, and they use firewood or something like that. So they cook on like giant, higher sources of, more hotter sources of heat, and so on. Or sometimes if they're really particular, what you can do is that, cook it twice if you have the time. So you're cooking it in smaller portions, so you're actually getting the same taste, and so on. But if it's too much work, this is usually the problem. But for up to 10 people, it's okay. I mean, more than that is where you have a problem.
Yeah. The other thing is, like, one doesn't really do home style cooking when you have so many people over, and this is home style cooking. So, okay. I think I will just have to sort of wing it and taste test in between and figure it out.
Just taste test. See, the thing with Indian cooking, right, is that it's very forgiving in terms of you can continuously adjust, and you have lots of levers of adjustment. Meaning that if it is bland, if it is bland, you can add salt and an acid, right? So often people think if something is bland, they just need more salt. That's not the case. You actually need more acid. So squeezing some sort of either a lime juice or adding tamarind or amchur is far more likely to improve the flavor.
Mhm.
The other one
Mhm.
you can do is to then the magic trick is obviously tadka, right? You can always add more flavor at the end by putting spices in hot fat or ghee or something, and then drop it in. It's almost always going to add more flavor, right? And the other thing you can always do is to instead of cooking vegetables directly in a gravy, always grill them separately in an oven, or just mildly saute them till they're lightly brown, and then add them to your gravy. The taste is much better. And so these are all tricks that you can use to sort of overall amp up the flavor and adjust the flavor as you go along, as opposed to worry about scaling.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for the question, Richa. Uma, you had a question, and I have turned on audio for you, so please go ahead and ask it.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Yes.
Yes, yeah. Thanks, Ashok and Peter, for a great table talk. I'm still waiting on the book to arrive here in Seattle. I'm thrilled that we're using the lens of science, especially chemistry, to Indian cooking, since I grew up with a dad who brought science into every sphere of our life and is a decent cook himself. Like everything that Ashok was saying about tadka is really about buoyancy, density of oil, ensuring flavor profile of spices, and also reverse osmosis, the gravy with respect to boiled potatoes. And
Yep.
yeah, and it's all that. So I moved to the US by 21, and so most of my cooking has been inspired by all the first principle deconstruction and Culinary Institute and everything. But one thing has always puzzled me, which perhaps Ashok can demystify. What is the chemistry behind wiping the hot cast iron pans with an onion's head, as many South Indian women do, before one makes dosas, adais, and other pancakes? Because it works every single time, and the batter never sticks to the tawa if you just do that. Thank you.
So the first thing is that next time you can try this. Take a cucumber, okay, or actually take any watery vegetable, any vegetable that's full of water, right? And just rub the piece of cucumber on the tawa, and you'll find that also works. So the reason why it works, obviously onion's added advantage is that it lends a bit of its taste also. So onion is preferable in that sense. So the essential physics here is that, see, first and foremost, the only thing that sticks to a vessel is proteins. Only amino acids stick because amino acids react. They actually react with the surface of the metal, and they stick. So only proteins stick, actually. So carbohydrates and fats do not stick. So that's the first thing. So it is actually only proteins. That is why if you cook something that is just pure starch, it's not going to stick at all. So it's only things that have a little bit of protein that's going to stick. So which is why eggs are notorious. Okay. So they will stick to any pan and so on, because they're high on protein. Okay, the higher on protein it is, meat also sticks. Okay, so what people do with cast iron is that we end up seasoning it. The act of seasoning essentially is that you're going to use some kind of oil and really heat it to such a high temperature that what ends up happening is that the oil breaks down and it polymerizes into almost what is like a plastic layer. Okay, so people sometimes don't realize that plastics are a lot similar to fats that we like to. So essentially, your fats actually turn into a polymer that coats the cast iron surface, so that it acts as a barrier between whatever is above and the metal below. So the heat will get transferred, but your proteins are not going to react with the metal and stick. So that's how it gets like a, if you will, a non-stick sort of experience. So this is how the whole seasoned cast iron as a non-stick science works, right? Now, what ends up happening over time is that some of our tawas they become unevenly seasoned, in that you end up washing it, or there'll be some small bits of metal that would have gone off, the seasoning doesn't stick, and so on. As it kind of, and many of these are not pure cast iron. Sometimes they get rusted, especially in South India. The weather is quite brutal. Things will rust quite easily, and so on. So what ends up happening is that you do need, therefore, to apply some layer of something that prevents the direct contact of the batter. And that all you're doing when you rub an onion is that the onion sugars essentially end up caramelizing, and they kind of, along with the liquid, a little bit of that water, if you will, they coat this thing so that the proteins are not directly hitting the cast iron. That's really all there is to it. So you could use any wet vegetable to do it, but onion obviously adds the most flavor. So that's really just why we use the onion.
Oh, great. Thank you so much.
Okay.
All right. There's a question from Reshmi who asked me to read her question, and it references Ashok's Instagram. So I'm just adding the link in.
Sorry, I'm done.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm talking to one of my favorite authors. No, Peter Griffin.
Peter Griffin.
And Peter Griffin is hosting with Krish Ashok.
All right. So Reshmi has a question. The question, she says, I have loved the science in Masala Lab, and the illustrations and the Insta videos are superb. I would like to know why I crave light foods or comfort foods or deep fried charts at different times. Can that give me control of what I eat? Is there a science that could demystify this?
There is science. As for whether it can help you address core nutritional issues is a much trickier thing. And since I'm not a trained nutritionist, I wouldn't want to venture into that area. See, but broadly, what ends up happening is that typically, and since the previous person was from Seattle, this is quite relevant. People living in wet parts of the world, or even Bombay during the monsoons, why we associate pakodas and samosas with the monsoons is because what ends up happening is that our body synthesizes vitamin D from sunlight. Okay, so what ends up happening is that when there's less sunlight, you synthesize less vitamin D. So there's and so on. And as a result of which, one of the vitamin D is actually important for the production of certain other things in the brain and so on. One of it is dopamine and all of that. So your serotonin levels actually go down. So people tend to feel depressed when it's rainy and cloudy. They genuinely feel depressed because their serotonin levels are down because your body is producing less vitamin D and so on. Okay. And so what your brain then does, it says, okay, sorry, there is a serotonin dip. I need to adjust. So how do I adjust? I need to figure out what are the things increase my these levels up. And typically eating sugars and carbohydrates is how you bring that levels back up. Okay. So your body craves high calorific food. And there is nothing more high calorific than carbohydrates fried in fat. Okay. That's holy grail. So samosas, pakodas, most amount of calories, in the smallest amount of food, if you will, right? So we crave deep fried carbohydrates, fried potatoes, pakodas, besan batter coated, deep fried, chicken or whatever it is, because our serotonin levels are low and we need to bring it back up. And you eat that. I mean, temporarily it brings. Of course, you then have other problems with diabetes and all of that. But that's how we crave. We tend to crave high carbohydrate, high fat food when during rainy, gloomy times and so on. Okay. Now, the other thing that also happens is that the fact that during rainy season everything is damp, we naturally gravitate towards drier, crunchier, crispier foods, because the last thing you want is a soggy texture in your mouth, because the contrast between the dampness outside and the crunchiness again makes you crave crunchiness. So crunchiness essentially is the more the amount of dehydration, the crunchier it is. So crunchiness is essentially less water. That's the basic idea, right? On the surface of the food. So which is why you crave crunchy, crispy, deep fried foods and so on. So that's essentially the effect. As for light food, I'm not necessarily sure. I mean, your body cycles are incredibly complex, and your brain keeps sending signals in terms of when it wants to eat, when it's feeling dehydrated, and so on. So that's a far more complex topic to which I don't have an answer. But this is essentially how at least the craving for crunchy deep fried foods happens as a result of this.
All right. A question from Mukta, a friend of mine, Mukta Rao. Did you or do you follow a different diet when writing the book? Did you usually follow a different diet when working on complex projects that needed more focus, etc.? Thank you. And that's kind of related to what I was also going to springboard from Reshmi's question, which is listening to our mind, listening to what our brain is telling us and what we want. I mean, given a large part of the time, your brain will be saying, just give me fried stuff, right? Give me fried carbs, give me sugary stuff and things like that, which is not necessarily the best thing for you at all points in time. And considering that, at least in India, we have this remarkably high incidence of diabetes and heart disease and so on and so forth. But yeah, to Mukta's question, what do you do? Do you follow different kinds of diets or anything like that when you need to say, bring yourself into a certain kind of frame of mind, the focused frame of mind that you need to say, write a book?
I'll say that with an important caveat. Please do not treat this as nutritional advice. Okay. And everybody's body is exceedingly unique. There are gender differences. There are differences across regions, different parts of the world. Everyone is so unique that it is nutrition is one of the most complex things you can imagine. So please do not seek out simple answers in general. As for what I do, I've been doing intermittent fasting for a few years now, meaning that I don't eat breakfast. So basically the last meal that I eat at dinner, and my next meal is the next day lunch. So as much as possible, I'm usually not eating anything anywhere between 14 to 16 hours after the dinner, right? So when I was writing the book, I was essentially waking up in the morning, and anecdotally, I can say that if you tend to be more sharper and focused if you're not on a full stomach after eating, tucking in 2-3 idlis and a couple of omelets and sausages and all of that. So in that sense, yes. I would say that for me, at least, intermittent fasting has continued to work, and it's also sort of kept my weight in check, as well as helped me be much sharper than I otherwise was. So it's clearly worked for me. Then again, as I said, it may not work for everyone. Not everyone can stay without food for 14 to 16 hours. I am told it works differently for women. Sometimes women do need to, at the max they can do is about maybe 12 hours or so. So again, check with an actual nutritionist before you start any fad diets. So please do not just adopt what I do or something. So that's what I will say.
The science-related aspect that I did want to touch on is something that we did sort of pass a little bit on in previous conversation, meat. We know that commercial meat is unsustainable, right? Factory farms, all of those things. And a friend of mine had an answer to this. She was vegan for a while, an American woman who came to India, thought it would be easy to be vegan in India, and then was found.
Oh, that's very hard.
That was
impossible.
Perhaps a myth.
Yes, right? Ghee is in everything.
Yeah. She has since
learned butter. Yes,
she's learned archery, and now permits herself meat that she has hunted with bow and arrow.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
That's it. I mean, not strictly speaking, but that was the idea behind it, as far as I recall. But
actually, if everybody hunted their own meat, I think it'll be pretty sustainable.
It's got to hunt and butcher.
Because most people are terrible. Most people are terrible hunters. So anyway,
I mean, you could, I guess, you learn how, to some extent, how to say kill food, but the butchering, all that. I mean,
exactly. No.
Squeamish about.
So one of the things I would say, the relationship you have with food has to change. Actually, forget about sustainability and all that. Sometimes people use these labels, and people immediately say, "Oh, he's an activist, he's an environmentalist," and there's a certain image that people have that I'm not going to take him seriously because he's an activist and all that. I just say, change your relationship with food, right? In the sense that understand where it's coming from. Forget the farmer protests and all that, right? Understand who's growing your food. How is it getting to you, right? Understand first the economics. Forget all the botany and forget all of the science behind it. Understand how your food gets to where it is. What's the history behind it, and understand that you can't be distancing yourself from the processing of your food. And this applies as much to maida or rice as it does to or jaggery or sugar as it does to the chicken and the pork that you might eat.
Yes, I mean, the writer and graphic novelist Amrita Patil wrote a piece for me once when I was with Forbes Life, when I was editing Forbes Life. And it was about this building which was called Atlantis. And this frame that stuck in my head of a little girl who's growing some stuff in her balcony. And her parents say, we're not worried about her because she knows what it takes to bring food to her table. Yeah. And, if you garden, like I try to grow stuff, and I have this one curry patta, which I have been trying to grow for 3 years. In that entire period of time, it has been beset by fungus, by mold, by whatnot. I have not harvested more than 2 or 3 sprigs from that damn thing in 3 years. Right now, a caterpillar just ate up every single leaf.
Yes.
And dangling from a stem there. And I'm like, okay, at least I'm going to get a butterfly. But But the fact is that I don't have no curry patta that I can use. I still buy my curry patta from the local
Yes.
vegetable.
And in Chennai, when you buy vegetables, the guy will give you half a tree worth of curry patta for free. Most of it will go for waste.
Yeah.
Okay. Because curry patta is one of those things that's notoriously hard to store. Short of putting it in the freezer, okay, you simply cannot store curry patta in the fridge for anything more than maximum a week. And that too, if you put it in a absolute airtight box, you remove all the leaves, you put it in an ultra airtight box, then it'll maybe last a week, after which it will start to discolor. Freezer is what you need to put, and he'll give you like this much. It's incredible. Yeah.
A little hack I learned in the simple recipe group was wash, dry, wrap in tissue in a Ziploc bag and put it in your fridge and take it out a bit. But yeah, no, actually the point I was getting to was, with a whole lot of what we eat, I know that I was so divorced from where my food came from that I simply had no idea of what, and this is going to sound really ridiculous, like what went into a dosa or a pizza. I had no idea. Then I started looking up this stuff and realized the processes that bring me that dosa or that bring me that pizza, just simple dishes that are universal. But so it's not just meat and factory farming that is the issue. There's a lot that goes into a number of other things. We have to accept a certain amount of factory processing, if you like, to just use a word very loosely, to be able to get food to us in an economical fashion. If I had to grow my own curry patta, just my own curry patta, I would have to have a lot more success than I have right now. My neighbor is growing bananas, and that one, he's away in the US right now visiting his children, and I'm watering it, and I got one bunch of bananas for 6 months of watering that plant.
Yeah.
And I have consumed a lot more bananas than that in the meantime. But yes, actually what I was trying to get to was also, what do you know about, the whole synthetic meat thing? We have there are two basic schools of thought there. One that you look at lab-grown meat, which is the reproduction of animal cells and growing them in a laboratory. And you have the vegetable-based protein that is aiming to replicate taste and texture and mouthfeel and things like that while not consuming meat, often being very highly processed in the point. Mukta, who asked that question, is a friend of mine who was omnivorous and then turned vegetarian and then turned vegan. And a lot of this is also designed for people who want the feel, the taste of meat. Because a vegetarian really doesn't care whether it feels like meat or tastes like meat. If someone who's vegetarian for religious reasons or cultural reasons, doesn't care.
Yes.
But what do you know about this entire thing of meat substitutes? Could you perhaps riff on that?
Yeah, this is so. Meat substitutes is something that I've been very, very fascinated about. And even if you go back to history, it's funny how China and Japan have a fantastic history of mock meat using soy protein, whereas India does not seem to, because I think and for broadly similar cultural reasons, Buddhism, right? So Buddhism and the larger Buddhas, this thing against, for ahimsa and so on. So the Chinese monks would not eat meat, but they still wanted the mouthfeel and the protein. And so essentially an entire cottage industry of being able to mock literally any other meat with soy protein, which fortunately happens to be pretty complete protein, right? See, the other thing is that most plant protein is not complete protein. Very few plant protein. Peas is one, and then your soy is another one. Very few plant protein are complete in that they have all the amino acids that we need. So which is why sometimes vegans tend to be protein deficient if they don't pay attention to it. So they have to be consciously making sure that they're getting complete protein from these kinds of sources and so on. So the other thing here is that the modern meat industry is very much a product of, shall we say, a combination of the Industrial Revolution essentially creating a middle class around the world that could afford to eat meat daily. Okay, it was never the case. So you just go back 100 years, it was something special that you did. And if you literally did not have chickens running around your house, you're not eating a chicken, right? So there's no giant factory farm from which you can just simply buy the meat It's very much a modern era thing as a result of refrigeration and many other things that that ended up happening and so on, right? And clearly, I think we let capitalism sort of just run wild and did not regulate it and did not see the effect on the planet that it has. The animal husbandry industry has, I think, the single largest impact in terms of carbon footprint, right? The global beef industry is one of the largest producers of greenhouse gases, particularly methane, and so on, right? So therefore it's clearly unsustainable, purely from a carbon footprint standpoint. And again, you're not even talking about the cruelty and the fact that you're using all manners of chemicals and antibiotics to keep them healthy and keep them clean, and you're putting them in cages and all those kinds of other moral issues that are also there. But even if you ignore all of that and simply say that at the end of the day I treat it as food and I don't treat it as an animal, you'll still end up screwing the planet if you don't either reduce your meat consumption or figure out an alternative. Now, the funny thing is that so if you just think about sort of just the basics of high school science, plants basically are the only things that make their own food, in the sense that they make their own mass by turning sunlight and the carbon dioxide that we breathe out into plant mass, right? So a common question that I ask school kids is that, this tree, where did all the weight of this tree come from? How did it become this many? How did it become 1,000 tons or whatever it is, right? It's like, it sucked the nutrition out of the soil. That's the wrong answer. The trees get their mass from the air. Okay, from the carbon comes from the air, not from the soil. Okay, and so therefore plants do that, and then animals evolved because it's a shortcut. Okay, because by eating plants, I can get all the calories that they created over months in a tiny amount of time. Okay, and that is why animals can move and plants cannot. Okay, the reason plants cannot move is because chlorophyll is insanely inefficient. It's a very bizarre story. It's actually a fascinating story. The reason chlorophyll is inefficient because chlorophyll evolved at a time when Earth's atmosphere did not have enough oxygen. Then all of a sudden, these plankton started doing photosynthesis. They became so successful so soon that from a tiny amount of oxygen, the Earth atmosphere went to the 21% oxygen that we have. And oxygen, by the way, is largely toxic for most things because it oxidizes most things, right? So we need defenses to prevent ourselves from getting oxidized, right? For some reason, chlorophyll is still adapted to the low oxygen environment. It hasn't had time to evolve. So which is why we don't have walking plants. We don't have plants that put out tentacles, grab people. We don't have as many carnivorous plants as we think there should be, right? I mean, imagine if the Venus flytrap was 10 feet big and it could just grab passing humans and eat it. But if chlorophyll was faster, we would have had that. So it's a remarkable story that the reason plants are just immobile and the only defenses they have is chemical. Right? They don't have physical defenses, animals. So for example, a potato takes 6 months to grow. You can get all of its calories in 10 minutes by cooking it. So that's how different it is. Now, because of these inefficiencies and the differences in the way animal protein is that we have to be very careful about whether you're getting complete protein, which is why a lot of the synthetic meat that you now get, which is made from plant protein, has to use pea protein from peas, which is complete, or soy. There are very few other. They sometimes mix wheat protein, gluten, and a bunch of other things also in order to make these things. So it has to be a mix. Okay. So therefore, plant constructing the right nutritional profile is the first challenge. The second challenge is getting the texture. See, plant cells are actually rigid. The intent of a plant is to stay rigid and immovable and hard. So all their cells are like that. Okay. The idea of an animal is movement. Okay. So our muscle tissue is, the cells are designed for movement. And that is what we are actually tasting as the texture of meat. It's the fact that an animal moves is why meat tastes the way it does. And it's the fact that a plant does not move is why a vegetable tastes the way it does. Okay. In order to get plant protein to taste like animal protein, you have to put it through some kind of processing. So you have to break it down into its foundational sort of amino acids, and then start layering them so that you can mock the texture of muscle. Okay. And it still does not have the same taste because that muscle has never exercised in its life, right? It's never had blood flowing through it. It doesn't have myoglobin. So the next evolution of that is for scientists to say, okay, let me inject myoglobin into this. Let me inject artificial blood. So for example, I think one of these companies, Impossible Foods, uses something called hemi, which is synthetically made blood, which mimics the redness of red meat. Okay. And otherwise, for most people listening, most people think the redness of red meat is blood. It's not blood. It's myoglobin. Okay. Myoglobin is a molecule that our muscles use to store oxygen. Okay. That's why it's red. Okay. It's not blood. So they have to mimic that. And so it's an iron-based molecule that they have synthesized, which is a synthetic blood that they then inject into this sort of plant protein made from wheat and peas and rice and these kinds of things, so that you get that kind of texture. All this done, you can now still only make plant-based meat that tastes like minced meat. So it tastes like burger mince or beef mince or pork mince or chicken mince. That's about it. You still can't make something that tastes like a steak or like a mutton chops or like, pork chops and so on. You just cannot, because that still requires you to have a living animal to do that, which is where the second technique, which is the idea of synthesizing the muscle tissue directly without the animal. Okay. And then using mechanical implements to exercise the muscle without the animal being there and so on, is the other approach, which is now insanely expensive. So at some point of time, it'll get there, right? But both of these are actually exceedingly promising in terms of our ability to get off large-scale consumption of meat. But in the short term, I think people need to reduce the amount of meat they consume, or at least maybe replace. Maybe if you're eating meat twice a week, maybe once try one of these plant-based meat substitutes, right? Instead of having, instead of having boneless chicken, I think you can have there are a bunch of companies in India that sell you plant-based chicken. It tastes pretty close to the dry boneless chicken that you're eating anyway. Okay, so for Indian food, I think that's more than good enough. So I think that's what I would encourage people to do.
Considering how much we tend to, as you said, it's the spices and the fats that you're cooking food in that gives it that Indianness kind of thing. And one of the issues I used to have before I started opening my mind out a little bit more to this was that in a lot of Indian food, the ingredients seem to be indistinguishable. I mean, you could just use that same gravy to cook potatoes or cook chicken or cook fish and whatnot. On people, this great love for basa, which essentially is like eating cardboard. And
it's really one of availability, right? In the sense that it's both remarkable and a dangerous thing about our global supply chain, that a fish is cheaper than the fish you catch just by the Bay of Bengal or the Arabian Sea. Mm-hmm. Is remarkable and dangerous by itself. But yeah, you're right. I mean, it's largely devoid of flavor. It's grown in such factory farmed in such large quantities. Mm-hmm. And again, at the end of the day, also, I think see, for a lot of people, the very fact that they get to eat meat more regularly just basically makes the market for something like this much higher, right? So therefore, somebody who's not a foodie, it doesn't matter. For them, the fact that he's eating fish is what matters. I mean, he was eating something else. Now he gets to eat fish 3 times a day. He'll happily take basa.
And yeah, I like to say that basa is the fish for people who don't like the taste of fish. But yeah,
so as I think Siddharth as a paneer of fish actually.
Yeah, Siddharth has a thing about paneer. And people talk about, the taste of poha. And I'm like, no, poha, it's all that you're putting into it. That's what makes the poha so interesting to you. But yeah, for just staying with the substitutes for a bit, what have you tried of these meat substitutes and what do you think about them?
So I have, when I was traveling, I have had Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods burgers, both burgers. I think Impossible Foods.
Impossible is.
I can't tell that. Yeah. I can't tell the difference. I would actually argue it tastes better than your McDonald's and your Burger King. Yeah. So I mean, short of eating at some sort of gourmet, fine dining based burger restaurant, Impossible Foods is better than most of your fast food burgers actually. And you would not guess that it's made from plants. It's just it is just tastes so beefy. It's incredible how beefy it is. Okay, and likewise, Beyond Foods makes their patties more available. I think Impossible Foods they only sell to restaurants, at least at that time. Maybe now they do. But Beyond Meat, I was able to pick it up from Seattle, and in fact I bought a bunch when I came back to India. So it's funny. So, it's incredible the amount of food that I used to carry back to India. I used to buy like avocados and potatoes from the US when I used to carry an extra suitcase and buy like, fill it with 20 kgs of potatoes and bring it back, because the American potatoes are way, way, way better. They're high starch, low moisture, so perfect for all kinds of things that you can do. So Beyond Meat is fantastic. So for minced beef, I think both of these are really, really good. Their chicken sausage is also really, really good. Okay. And I would actually so in India, I have, there is one company that I've seen. There's a company called Blue Tribe. This is not an advertisement for them, but honestly, this is the only company. I happen to see them on Instagram, and they just ordered. They make minced chicken. So actually, if you're the type that makes keema with chicken, it's largely indistinguishable. It's pretty good. Okay. Now, the problem is that sometimes people look at the ingredients on that and go, no, I'm not eating this. Because the part of the texture and mouthfeel of meat. Okay. So one is, he spoke about protein. The second important mouthfeel of meat comes from fat. Okay. And animal fat has its own unique flavors. We all know that chicken fat, your schmaltz or your lard and all of that by themselves are fantastic cooking mediums. Okay. With so much flavor, right? And so the reason they are is that they're all saturated fats. Okay. So if you want to, so the only equivalent saturated fats that you can use are coconut oil or hydrogenated palm oil, which we also know as dalda. Okay. Now, so coconut oil is fine, but coconut oil adds its own that apparently North Indians don't like. So when the company says that when they use coconut oil, the North Indians didn't like the taste of the chicken because they said they're getting coconut smell. Okay. And so they have to use a odorless saturated fat, which in India is hydrogenated palm oil, also known as vanaspati or dalda. Okay. And so people immediately see dalda and say, no, this is trans fat and all that. Yeah, they use trans fat free hydrogenated palm oil. So you're okay. Okay. But people look at that and go, but they also have to use wheat gluten, which comes from maida. So they have to list maida, and the people say, no, this is made from maida. I will not eat it. Maida is poison and all of that. So I think a lot of education is required, and people say that, look, boss, it's the amount of stuff that you eat is a problem. You shouldn't be eating this 3 times a day either. Okay. Maybe you should eat it only as a special occasion. And when you eat on that special occasion, use the plant-based meat instead of the actual live meat. So that's really what it is.
The science part of it, and people talk about genetically modified food, for instance, and really so much of what we consume is genetically modified, except over a longer period of time. I mean,
yeah.
Yes. What is rice? What is wheat? It's a grass which has seeds. It's very inedible, and over centuries and centuries of domestication, you get what we can eat now, right?
My absolute most favorite story about rice, okay, is I heard this from a person I met at some panel discussion I was at many years ago. He was one of those guys who did mechanical engineering from IIT and then decided that he wanted to do farming and apply his mechanical engineering knowledge to farming and so on, better design implements. He was one of those guys based in Chennai, right? And he told me this fantastic story about rice. And he basically said that, the rice grass, okay, right? Which, the wild rice grass used to be about 10 feet tall. Okay. And it seems bizarre for us to imagine, but then you look at a sugarcane or you look at a bamboo, grasses can grow that tall. Okay. So it's not such an odd thing. So rice was actually almost like a bamboo. It was like almost 10 feet tall. Okay. And so it was clearly impractical for any kind of grain collection. Okay. So ancient man figured out a way to stunt its growth. How do they stunt it? By planting them close together so that they fight for resources. So the growth is stunted. But if you just plant them close together, they won't have enough resources to make grain also, right? So the smartness there was to say, fine, I'm going to grow it partially till they grow up to this length. Okay. Then I'm going to transplant them to another field and give them more space, and now give them more resources. That's how rice cultivation has happened since time immemorial. You have to plant the rice close together in one field, and then you have to, at one point, you have to transplant it to another field. And then over time, every part of the world has its own myths and rituals related to that. In South India, the person doing the planting and the transplanting has to be a woman. I mean, good way to get free labor, I suppose. But, they say, it's connect that to fertility and all of that. All that stuff happens. So all of this ultimately is because you wanted to stunt the rice. And stunning thing is that we continue to do this regardless of the fact that we now have stunted varieties of rice, because you can't change the culture, right? The modern rice plants will not grow to 10 feet. no matter what you do. So all you're ending up doing is inefficiently wasting time and resources doing this transplanting, losing some amount of productivity in the process. But for the most part, these are the varieties of rice we use are all naturally stunted over time. Okay. And by the way, they've been naturally stunted by artificial selection for thousands of years. It's not just the modern genetic modification we're talking about. Since the dawn of civilization itself, it would have already been pre-stunted because we've been selecting only those varieties for a long time, right? And so essentially, I think, this is the entire thing about genetically modified is that people have there are valid concerns about some specific, and again, I would actually say that it's a policy failure, don't blame the technology for it. Okay? Technology can make you an atom bomb. It can make you nerve gas. It can also make you terminator seeds. Basically, you can basically keep a farmer in your thrall by making sure that the plant does not produce the next generation of seeds, which people are expecting to use and all that. You can create things like Roundup, where you're literally you're genetically modifying the plant to produce a poison that kills the pest. And the only way for it to work is if you're completely in that. It's like buying into an Apple ecosystem, right? So the only thing is that you can use this technology to create, shall we say, social and commercial and economic structures that are exploitative, right? But rather than say that I will not use any of the technology, I think you should be going after the economic systems that allow this to happen, right? Rather than say that, no, I will not eat anything that is genetically modified. That's crazy, because literally everything you eat today is genetically modified, except that it was done very clunkily thousands of years ago using artificial selection over centuries. And from the 18th century or 19th century onwards, in the 20th century, by the way, even right now, if you irradiate seeds with radiation, that's not considered genetic modification, semantically. Okay, and scientists do that all the time. They just take one generation of seeds, they irradiate it, and they plant it, and they see if any seeds show any mutations that are useful. This is a complete crapshoot, right? And then they do this thousands of times. Okay? And that kind of, in many countries, this use of radiation is not considered genetic modification when it literally is. It's doing the exact same thing. Okay, it's changing the DNA. But when you do it precisely in a lab and change exactly the genes that you want, then people have a problem. And I think that's what we need to change.
Yeah. I mean, just the foods that we have mentioned by name in this course of this conversation, the kind of potato variety that you get in, say, Peru is, I remember seeing this thing going around, which was some 20 different varieties. Chili, the flavorfulness of chili that you would get in
Mexico,
right, in Mexico. You, I think, tweeted about that very recently.
Yes.
The things that we've brought in from other parts of the world, like tomato, chili, and a bunch of other things. Bananas, which I mentioned at one point in time. The white banana is practically inedible. And now we wind up all eating one particular type of banana because that was commercially viable, and which led to the term Banana Republic.
No. Correct. Not only that, right? So the reason we all eat the Cavendish banana, which is not the most tastiest banana, is because the previous giant global single cultivar died out from that one fungus, right? And then, and now, by the way, the next fungus to wipe out Cavendish has already come in Latin America, and they're struggling to contain it. I won't be surprised if the Cavendish disappeared and is replaced with something else, which is genetically modified and happens to be resistant to the current version of that blight. And then you wait for evolution or wait for that fungus to figure out how to attack that one, and then it's a battle all over again. So that's how it is. Single monoculture, like it literally, that's the thing, right? Every banana plant we are eating around the world, the Cavendish, every one of those plants is a clone. It's insane to think about it biologically. That none of them underwent any kind of sexual reproduction, any kind of variation. No, every single one of these bananas is a clone. It's insane. It's some of the most surreal, alien things you can imagine, and most people don't know it.
Yeah. And even with the animals that we eat, there's been modification there, selection there.
I
was reading how the turkeys that Americans grow, chicken and turkey, are sometimes so top heavy, literally, because they're bred for a large amount of breast tissue. They cannot reproduce. They can't have sex. So, it's only artificial, reproduction there. Because the turkeys are...
Sorry, so I also say this to all of the cow warriors in India. Have you seen how, your milk producing cows, how they're inseminated? Do you think they have natural sex? There's a goddamn scary looking machine. Okay. It's artificial. All of them are artificially inseminated. That's what, as I say, jokingly say that in India is the only place where we consider milk to be vegetarian and eggs to be non-vegetarian. And yet milk is the product of a non-consensually impregnated mammal. Okay. The egg is the product of a hen that has been denied sex. And yet we think milk is okay. And eggs are apparently non-vegetarian. So it's funny. Yeah. Anyway.
Sorry, there is another question here. Harini Sekhar asks that we ask this question on our behalf. Certain recipes call for roasting spices individually. Others are okay with roasting together. How does the flavor change?
So ultimately, the choice of whether you would roast them together or separately should be determined by the structure of the spice. So some spices have very thin coats and are susceptible to heat and will burn easily. So for example, some things like for example, dhania is far more sensitive to heat than jeera, right? So if you put dhania and jeera together, the dhania is likely to burn well before the jeera is reasonably well browned. Okay, so that's why it's generally good to do them separately. So over time, you can figure out that some things you can put together. Like for example, fennel and saunf and jeera you can put together. Fenugreek also you can add roughly around the same time and so on. But I find that red chilies burn very quickly on a hot pan and so on. So you might want to do that separately. Sesame burns very, very quickly. Poppy seeds burn really quickly and so on. So again, I think as you sort of figure out, then you can then figure out which ones you can combine and which ones you do separately. At the end of the day, it's about flavor comes from you making sure that you're browning them to their optimal level, short of burning. Okay. So if you put everything together, chances are some things are under browned and others are over browned. So that's the only risk.
There's a note that Richa put in, which I'm just mentioning in passing. It's not a question. And we tend to disassociate meat we eat from the animal it comes from. We call pig meat pork. We call cow meat beef.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to happen, at a tangent from that with birds. We call turkey, turkey. We call chicken, chicken. Perhaps because
there's history. There's very little. So there's very dead simple, lovely little bit of historical trivia to why we do that. And it goes back to the Norman conquest of England, actually. So English, the English, and by the way, this is true only in English. It's not the case in other languages. Okay. And the reason for this is that the French, the Normans, the French invaded England famously in 1066. And most people don't realize that for 200 years, the English nobility only spoke French. They switched to English much later. For 200 years, the elites were speaking only French and the common people, Anglo-Saxons, were speaking the Old English. Okay. Anglo-Saxons, the Old English people, they did not use different terms for the animal at the beat. So the Anglo-Saxon word is cow. The Anglo-Saxon word is goat. The Anglo-Saxon word is pig. These are all Anglo-Saxon words. Okay. But the elites said that they are not going to use the language that those, their peasants were using. And so they used the French words for that. So they use mouton, beef, and pork, which are French words to describe what they were eating, so that they won't have to use the language that the peasants use. That's why English has the distinction. There is no other reason. Okay, and we just continue to use it after that. And then over time, so English became a mishmash of 30% French vocabulary and 70% Anglo-Saxon Germanic vocabulary, and so it ended up just becoming like that. But that's the history behind why we do this. But yeah, it ends up having that effect of you separating the animal from the this thing. But the reason why we use this is just simply down to the Norman conquest of England.
I knew bits of that, but I didn't somehow associate that. I knew these were French origin words and
correct,
the Anglo-Saxon roots of the names of the animal. Richa also had this thing, would like to hear Ashok riffing on The Great Indian Kitchen, the film The Great Indian Kitchen, and how the cooking of food is gendered.
Oh yeah, very much is. I mean, it's what a fantastic film. Huh? I mean, it's literally most of the women I know in my family were like, I'm going to get my husband to sit with me and watch this movie, and I'm going to watch him cringe And I think that's exactly what it was. And I think it's really so spot on. And it was so spot on that there is even a moment where one guy in the film offers to cook. He says, "Oh, you guys, you women, take a break. We will cook some biryani for you," or something like that, right? And they proceed to make an unholy mess of the kitchen, which the lady has to clean up, right? So it's not just the cooking. It's also, even when men cook, they still end up adding all kinds of additional labor, which they don't want to do, washing dishes, or the emotional labor of constantly also figuring out, for instance, okay, so this old person needs to have less salt in his food because he has IBP. This kid cannot have too many chilies in the food, and so on. So the amount of emotional labor that goes into feeding a family is not just a matter of putting on an apron, looking at a recipe, and cooking food, right? I mean, that's doing it as a hobby, as sort of like a stuff that you can put on Instagram and get likes. Because in India, if a guy makes an omelette, he will be applauded. But I mean, I'll also say very candidly, more than half the success of my book is because I'm a guy. Okay, there could have been a woman who wrote about the science of Indian cooking, and I won't be surprised if it didn't sell, because it's like almost Indians expect that, oh, women are just supposed to cook. Okay, if they're explaining the science, okay, no big deal. Oh, guy knowing cooking and also explaining the science, that is somehow novel and interesting, so we will buy it, and so on. So I mean, I'll admit that, right? So therefore, I think the Great Indian Kitchen is just a fantastic film, and I think everyone should watch. And thanks to subtitles, everyone can now watch these films now. So it's absolutely brilliant. It is very much cooking in India is very much gendered. It continues to be gendered, even if guys are posting in Instagram photos of food and all that. Chances are that many of them are not. They're doing this as like a performative thing rather than something that they do to feed the family. Right? It's one thing to do a special occasion, or you take rest today, I'll cook for you. That's not cooking, right? So that's putting on a show, right? Yeah, that's being loving to your wife, all that is fine. But really taking this seriously is really genuinely understanding that you have to divide these chores, right? I'm not saying you have to cook. At the very least, maybe cut vegetables, maybe offer to do the dishes, or take care of some of those other kinds of chores. Maybe baking, like, cornflakes or Bonvita for the kid. Many Indian men will not even do that. Okay, so the amount of parallel processing that Indian women often have to do is just insane. So yeah,
something when I started the Simple Recipes group, I thought it would be people like me that would benefit the most. People, friends here like Richa and Uma and others who I knew were good cooks, were people who I had. Uma, I didn't know at that time. Richa, I did. And a number of other people who are here. I was like, these are the people who are going to be the experts, who are going to tell doofuses like me, who had the privilege of never learning how to cook, right? I never had to. It was as simple as that. And now I had to. So now let me see what I'm going to do. And I thought it would be mainly for people like me who would want to join this group. And when I invited people, I invited with no gender segregation. In fact, I erred on the side of inviting more men because I thought more men would find this group useful. Most women wouldn't. The group to this day is 80% women.
Yeah.
The tale that I hear most often, and not even sometimes with anger, sometimes with resentment, but often just as a matter of fact, is I have a full-time job. I am also working from home. I am doing as many meetings as my husband is, but I'm one who has there are people at home who do not want to eat food that is not fresh. So fresh meals a day, often for people with different dietary requirements. An older person has some restrictions, a younger one who will eat this, the man who will want his chapatis, otherwise it's not a meal. Or, or the other man who will want his rice.
Yeah. I will not eat rice at night. I want chapatis. Like, okay, just go, just use, then go, please make it, right? Because chapatis are some of the most ridiculously time inefficient things, right? I mean, you should be, so that's why I often make this observation that often rice eating cultures tend to be friendlier to women than wheat eating cultures. So, yeah.
I think that's a whole huge debate which we could have made. But yeah, no, this entire thing of and sort of tying it with your work. I mean, you're global head for digital workplaces. We are going through a year and a half now of all of us changing our very idea of work. Some of us have the privilege of being able to do work that we can do at home. Some of us don't. Some of us have to be there in person to do the work that we do. And this is not necessarily a economy kind of privilege. You will need a lab to be a scientist, right? To go there and do your experiments, or to have the machinery available, or you will need to be in a shop to earn your shop assistance fee, that kind of thing. There is that difference. But yeah, how do you see technology changing us, both in terms of the way that we look at work and the way that we look at food?
Yeah. No, absolutely. So one is that, see, I think my job role actually involves essentially reimagining the workplace, essentially the technologies of work. So particularly we've been very busy because, most companies have had to switch to remote work. So, all the technology that we use today to enable that is all stuff that, my team manages and so on. So interestingly enough, there is a deeper way to think about this. I think the notion of the modern workplace, the 9 to 6 job in an office 25 kilometers away from where you live, is by itself a fundamentally broken structure that we have taken for granted is the only way that work has to happen. Okay? That it cannot. So we've just taken that for granted, and that structure is innately problematic. It's filled with tons of biases. For starters, it offers employment only to people living in large cities, which by itself is not sustainable. Okay. Second, in the context of India, it has a tremendous class bias towards anyone who does not speak fluent English. And three, it is innately gender biased, in that it makes it impractical for many women who have to juggle families. So most people, for example, they join a company like TCS, and then when they're 23, 24, maybe nowadays the age at which they're getting married is increasing, but by 25, they have to take a break because they're getting married, and their husband does not want her to work, or is expecting that she'll drop whatever she's doing and come to Bangalore or Bombay or wherever that guy lives, right? And so these structures by themselves are sustaining these things. See, you cannot divorce somehow the workplace from all the rest of the gender bias problems that you have that are broken in your society, right? And so in that sense, I think the way I see it is that, for starters, companies essentially offered a very convenient excuse to society, and particularly to men, by saying, you have to come all this way and you have to work 15 hours a day, and this is my work culture and this is how you do it. You have no time for anything else. Okay. And so, like, oh, sorry, I cannot deal with office pressure and also help you in cooking, just became a very convenient thing for a lot of men to say, right? Essentially devaluing the amount of effort that it takes to actually run a home, which is in most situations as much, if not more, involves more parallel processing and more tension, and is unpaid compared to whatever nonsense, email and PowerPoint nonsense that you're doing at work, right? So the interesting thing is that for the first time during this pandemic, companies were forced to pay attention to what's happening at home. Okay, because your employee is now in his home. He's not in your office, in a sterile environment, isolated from the problems at home. The company doesn't care whether you're having an ailing grandmother. You figure it out. Can you work 10 hours a day? I'll give you the salary. If you can't do that, sorry, we'll let you go, and so on. So that was essentially what that's the culture that we encourage and we let companies get away with. Right? So what is happening now is that companies are now forced to pay attention to what you're doing at home. Now, your home is now an important extension of the workplace, right? There is no work-life balance. There is now a work-life continuum, right? I'm here. I'm on a video conference. I have to sit with my son for his online class, right? I have to play with him sometimes. I have to sit and help him with his homework. I have to go cook. I have to go put the washing machine. I have to deal with an Amazon delivery guy. And this continuous partial attention is what a company gets now. And so now, therefore, I think there's an opportunity to fundamentally rethink what work means. Okay. And just going back to that 9 to 6, isolate, just forget about what's happening at home and let women take care of it, is not a model that will ever work. And I think the companies that will figure out a way to sustain this hybrid way will do better, will attract better talent, will be able to hire more women, will be able to hire more diverse talent from smaller towns and have that sort of thing. So I think, in that sense, I'm optimistic that it can result in that. But then again, I'm overall a technology pessimist. So let's see where things go. But that's where things are right now.
these are the conversations we have. Everybody seems to be waiting for when things will go back to before. And I keep thinking this, that I don't think we will go back to what it was before.
That was not some ideal perfect.
Exactly.
See, there are aspects of the physical workplace that were nice. It was good to see people in person. It was good to have water cooler conversations. It was good to have coffee with them. It was good to brainstorm in person. All of things are great, but that's a tiny portion of what the office was, right? The elephant in the room is you sitting in a cubicle for 9 hours, traveling 20-25 kilometers, 2 hours a day through traffic, and then not being able to completely be isolated from your home for upwards of 9 to 15 hours a day. None of that is good, right? And all the biases that come with the fact that you're in a physical workplace, biases the fact based on how you look, whether how tall you are, what gender you are, whether you can speak English fluently, whether you're extroverted or introverted. Every one of these things determine whether you'd be successful in a physical workplace, none of which are important to you actually doing your job. Right? So therefore, I really think that, we have to think about the home and this model of working as a fundamental opportunity to change society as we know it, right? And I think therefore that will hopefully, change a lot of conversations around food also, about how you think about food, and whether you just simply keep ordering Swiggy three times a day, or will you actually get into the kitchen, start figuring out where your food comes from, be more conscious about what you're eating, and more importantly, stop giving up all of these nonsense ideas of freshness, which is completely stupid and pointless. If you have a refrigerator, things are fresh. Okay, freshness is a biological concept of whether there's biological activity happening in your food. If you place something in the freezer, there is no biological activity. It's fresh. It's frozen in time. So it's as good as fresh. In many cases, it's better than fresh. Okay, so that's a separate debate altogether. But the whole point is that I think hopefully people change these ideas.
Yeah. I was just coming to, it's like, it's a time that we can introspect, we can look at these things and say, okay, how can we be better in this time? And I was hoping that in the course of this pandemic, with so many of us, this was one time where the entire world was in the same boat at some point, some of them for shorter periods, some for longer, and that it would cause more men, for instance, to think men are making decisions. Men are making the software. We use the word tech bros for a reason.
Yeah.
The algorithm.
So men are not just making software, by the way. Men are also designing the kitchen appliances that we use, and they're all terribly designed.
Yes.
They're not designed for women. They're hard to maintain. They're hard to clean. You can know cooked in his life, and has never probably interacted with women in his life. Okay. So, things will be impossible to move. They'll require muscular bicep strength, and they'll be impossible to maintain. And many of our gadgets are just terribly designed.
Yeah, there's so much of that. Yeah. And I was hoping, like I said, that this would be a time when people would, because for instance, they had to cook, they would realize what you needed to design better. They would, that kind of thing. But unfortunately, what we did see a lot of was the man of the house striding around importantly, wanting silence for his video conference or, on his call, and everybody had to be quiet. The woman had to do it with children demanding attention, all of that stuff.
Or the guy saying, no, you know what? I'm going to spend the next 3 days making sourdough bread. Okay. I'm going to do slow ferment now, right? When the family is like, boss, I just need something to eat. Okay. So
yeah, if you don't put
impracticality as well. But I think at the end of the day, hopefully if there's the pendulum is slightly swung in the right direction, hopefully the momentum will be there. Let's see. But at the end of the day, I think people have to stop seeing this as some kind of art or a hobby, right? It has to be practical. And it's actually quite funny. You can actually see that I was talking to somebody in the consumer goods industry. The sales of convenience appliances, electronic appliances, things like Instant Pots and those kinds of things, just rocketed during the, particularly in India, during the pandemic. Why? Because more men were cooking. Okay. Now, as long as they weren't cooking, no, hand ground. You have to, go harvest the wheat yourself and do it with your hand. But the moment they're cooking, all automation is now fine, right? As you know, I think as Selina Meyer from Beep says it, that if men got pregnant, we'd get abortions at an ATM. Okay. Yeah. So that's basically the world we live in. Yeah.
Yeah, we're just looking at various things. The stuff that happens to women's bodies around periods and what we can do with the medicine for that. There is really so little research around that. It's because And it's not necessarily that men are all assholes. It's just that men are not even thinking about these things because they don't have periods.
Yeah. No, I think it's not that. So the thing is that for terrible things to happen in society, it's not like you need a lot of assholes, actually. You just need a few assholes and a lot of disinterested people. And as long as you're just unaware, and you're just going about your life, not wanting to be aware of structural problems and so on, that's all you need to sustain any kind of evil. So that's the tragedy of the world, if you will. But yes, that's where we are.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the cool thing here is that folks like you who are in a position to influence this kind of thinking are thinking about this and are doing things about it. Aside from being the popular blogger and Instagrammer and whatnot, you head a global vertical, and which is all about this stuff. So good. But I'm just going to, oh, sorry.
On a lighter note, I do have to say that sometimes, my wife also tells me that, she so accurately predicts that, one of the problems that's going to come is that your book is going to spawn a ton of highly annoying men who are going to mansplain their wives and partners about the science of cooking. And they'll all be guys who like cook once or twice a week. And then they'll be explaining to everyone else that they can see that, oh, by the way, Krish Ashok said this, and you're going to unleash all of that evil on the world. I don't know how true she is, but I can see signs of it sometimes. But yeah, so I hope, every time at least I meet someone who likes the book, I tell them, every time I try and tell them that, please don't use this book to mansplain people who actually cook in your life. So please do the cooking yourself, maybe.
As I once said, give a man a chapati, he'll eat for the day. Teach a man to make a chapati and he'll never shut the fuck up about it.
Oh, yeah, man. Yes, exactly.
Yeah. But sorry, there was a question from Rishmi, which I missed, which was those small yellow fruits. Are they lemons or limes? I'm always confused with the two and what juice I'm using.
If this is India, it's all limes. Lemons are the big fat things you get in the West. Generally, lemons are not available here. So you get limes. So even the yellow ones are limes, actually. So they're just slightly riper. They're green first, then they turn yellow. So, but the lemons are actually the ones with the really thick rind and much more juice. So limes, both the yellow ones and the big sweet ones, which incidentally originally came from Mozambique, which is where they call Mozambique. So,
oh, okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So actually, there was a guy called Musa bin something. So that's and so that Sultan there was named that, and so Vasco da Gama was the one who introduced it. And so then they asked him where it came from. They said it came from this place where Musa bin something was ruling, and so that's apparently the story behind how we call it. The entire coast calls it Mozambique because of that.
Right.
So they actually came from Africa. So the Indians were not used to, so it became because the Indians were not used to the concept of a sweet lime. So it's so sweet that's not sour at all, barely sour at all. So yeah.
And aside from variety, and also there's the things of size. I mean, I remember who's the American actor of Indian descent, Mindy Kaling, and she had Kamala Harris come over
to
her kitchen, and Kamala Harris is chopping an onion, and that onion was the size of my head.
Yes.
Or, I'm exaggerating, but I was like,
yeah, it's huge. Yeah.
That's an onion.
Yeah, they're huge. American onions are huge. I think Reshma is also asking. She's asking whether it's a nartanga. That's actually a citron. So that again is not a lemon. It's another family from the citrus family. It's called a citron. Yeah. So that's nartanga.
Yeah. But yeah, just this size difference. I would be surprised at American recipes talking about 1 or 2 pods of garlic till I saw what they meant when they were talking about garlic.
Yes. So also so you have generally the general idea is that if you one, you can obviously genetically modify them for size. That's one. The second thing is the more pesticides and more sterile your growing environment, the larger your vegetables will be. And the more pest heavy, the more fungus and more dangers that lurk around the plants, the smaller your vegetables will be, because the plant has to use a fair amount of its resources to fight pests and so on. Okay. And the other thing is that a lot of these pest fighting chemicals that the plant produces is what we consider to be flavor. So that is why organic produce tastes better than the non-organic produce, because the plant has to fight a ton of pests, and so it ends up putting a lot more biochemical, these chemicals that fight against these insects and all of that adds flavor to the vegetable, which is why I often tell people that when you go to the vegetable market, never pick the biggest, fattest, cleanest looking vegetable. Always pick the slightly bruised, misshapen ones, because that plant has undergone far, far more attack from pests. So on an average, misshapen, smaller, bruised vegetables are tastier than clean looking ones. So that's how you should shop.
Ashok, I wonder if you would do us another little reading from the book.
Let me see if
But folks, yeah, if you do have any other questions, if you want to come up on audio right now, just put your hand up, use the Zoom raise hand function, and I will let you speak. Or you could put it in text if you don't want to think. It's now, there are fewer people here. We're down to about 20, so I can keep track. Earlier, we had lots more people in the room, so I was finding it a little difficult to keep track of stuff in chat, which is why I was saying, please put it in the Q&A box. But yeah, you could put it in chat, or you could use the Zoom raise hands, and I will turn on mic for you. But yeah, right now, can we just, we'll just listen to Ashok reading another extract from the book.
So this is actually the last paragraph for the book, from the biryani chapter. So this is the so food science, to paraphrase Albert Einstein, is knowledge that opens up yet another fragment at the frontier of human ingenuity. 3 billion years ago, the electromagnetic radiation from a 4.5 billion year old thermonuclear in a fireball 150 million kilometers away, until date, is filtered by the Earth's atmosphere to prevent us from being fried by a chlorophyll molecule concocted by a cyanobacteria floating in the ocean. Symbiotic relationship with larger organisms to ultimately develop into plants. Billions of years later, a large bipedal ape managed to figure out how to grow these plants to produce grains and vegetables, and then domesticated animals that eat these plants. With the discovery of fire, he invented what is quite possibly the most game-changing thing in history: cooking, where hard-to-digest plant products filled with evolutionarily designed nasty defense mechanisms were turned into nourishment that helped this ape develop its brain to the point where it fine-tuned what was just nourishment into the art and science of gastronomy. Today, it lets us sit and ponder with awe at the fundamental interconnectedness of things of the most perfectly cooked biryani.
Thank you for that. That was indeed, a fun way to look at that entire thing. Comments there, yeah, Sonal is saying, fruits picked by birds are the tastiest. And, that's an important part of the way that we look at what we grow. That, I mean, at one point, one level, I'm pissed off that that caterpillar finished off all my curry patta. But I was also, I saw, chrysalis hanging from there, and that's going to be a butterfly at some point. I was talking to people who do gardens and stuff like that, and I was getting these little semicircular holes in all my leaves, and they said, chill, that's not doing you any harm. Those are just leaf cutter bees cutting those out. And if you're doing anything to help bees in the world that we're in right now, you're doing
it's good. Yeah. Actually, so many things. So I have a terrace garden, and my father-in-law, who lives in the house below me, he's a fantastic gardener, right? And so many counterintuitive things that you learn by paying attention. So for starters, that the chili plant, as soon as it gets to 2 or 3 leaves, right, and it starts branching, so he'll cut off the main stem just above those branches. And I'm like, okay, this took 4 weeks to come out, and you just cut off most of the plant. He said, no, otherwise you'll just get one stem. Now, when you cut this off, the plant is going to put all of its nourishment into all those branches. So you'll get more stems that fruit. So you'll get more chilies. So it's just, it's just simple things like this, right? And also there's a neem tree. And then he would basically collect all the dried neem leaves that fall down, put them in the microwave, dehydrate it, and make neem powder, and then mix it with water, and then spray it on the natural pesticide, right? And then all, which is the eggshells and so on, which just go into the pots again. That way, it just adds more nourishment for the plants and so on. Shrimp shells, crustacean shells, crab and shrimp shells, again, powder them, and then you add them you'll get really, really tasty tomatoes and all that, because shrimp shells trick the plant into thinking that it's under insect attack, because shrimps are related to insects. Okay, so they have shrimps have crustaceans have a material called chitin in their shells. Okay, in their skin, and so the plant detects chitin in the soil, and it's like, oh, I'm under attack, and so it biochemically will produce more stuff that ends up being a tasty vegetable, and so on. And then other small, tiny, very plant-specific things that you often do is that you kind of realize that all of this knowledge is literally in the heads of not the zamindars who own the goddamn farms in India, but the Dalit laborers who do this on a daily basis. And it's this tacit knowledge that we are all going to lose at some point of time, because one, they're telling their children to work in large companies. They're saying that nobody wants to do agriculture, and doing that. And we've never given them access to education and so on. We're going to lose all of this knowledge, right? And it's, it sort of pains me to think that we're going to lose a ton of this sort of tacit wisdom that only very few people have actually in reality. If there was a catastrophe, the number of people who'd be able to restart agriculture is vanishingly small. Okay, there are more people in jail in the US than there are farmers in the US. That is how bad things are. It is just insane. And pretty soon it's going to be the same thing in India.
And I mean, yeah, but in the US, of course, there's also a large amount of mechanized farming, which makes it less labor intensive. But yeah, what you were saying about knowing what you're growing, these things about living closer to the land, having a closer relation, it's not sustainable in the sense you can't necessarily spend the hours that a farmer does, but knowing more about it, I mean, grow something on your own is one thing that I recommend to everyone. Grow some food.
Just see how hard it is.
Yeah.
Incredibly hard it is. And also realize, it also gives you a deeper appreciation of the fact that every form of life in this planet is competing for the same calories. Okay. Mm-hmm. Right. And so it is just human ingenuity that you can try and keep away the really nasty ones, right? While at the same time, like for example, my father-in-law would plant a jasmine plant and a bunch of these other very, very really pleasant smelling flowering pots right next to the food related ones. The idea being that they attract a ton of pollinating bees, pollinating insects, right? Mm-hmm. And so that then end up pollinating the other things as well, right? I was like wondering why I only put the chili in like one pot. Now there is that chili plant seems to be there in multiple pots. How did that happen? It's because, well, they get pollinated. So it's just that if you and to think in the form of an ecosystem, that it's not a zero-sum game, in that you can do this sustainably and so on, and also recognize how hard it is and how much effort it is, right? And that you have to put weeks and days before realizing that the seed's not sprouting, right? And so on. It's quite incredible.
And this stuff you were talking about as well, about things like what goes into your plants and whatnot. I haven't, I empty my dustbin now once in a month, once in 2 months, because all that goes into it is packaging from anything that comes out of the house. Yes. Everything else, I sit on the fridge again there. I have enough space to grow stuff, and I have enough
I know a part of the house that just stocks Amazon boxes. So it is just insane. Okay. The amount of, I think every one of us is spending almost, I think 5 to 10x on Amazon and all of those boxes. And they sent these giant boxes with like one tiny amount of,
some stuff like that. But just, realizing what goes in there, how much of your stuff that you use can actually be used productively. All my vegetable waste, all my meat waste, all of that goes into compost, goes into the soil, and is growing stuff for me. I have space and the luxury to be able to do that, to be able to compost and all that, which is not possible. But for instance, even if you live in a small flat in a congested part of the city, you can, for instance, raise awareness about it and insist that, vote with your votes, with your pressure on your local municipal corporation about segregation. In Vashi, in New Bombay, where I live, I segregate. I kept the plastic aside to give it to this guy, and this guy picks up the bag of plastic bags and dumps it into the same bin. And I was like, "Aren't you keeping it together?" And he says, "Like,
Also, by the way, also most plastic is not recyclable. Even recyclable plastic is not recyclable, incidentally. So that's just a myth
One
we've
of
been
those
sold by the fossil fuel industry.
polite fictions that we just sort of
I
make.
think I was just saying, Reshmi say that does veg biryani exist or not?
I was coming to that one as
It
well.
absolutely does, right? It absolutely does. I just remember this. Idli is gluten-free bread. Okay, masala dosa is a taco, is a potato-filled taco, and so therefore, do not labels and language exist for creating a common understanding between people. Okay, so nobody gets to say there is no such thing as veg biryani. If you make veg biryani and you call it veg biryani, and other people understand what it means when you say veg biryani, it exists. Okay. Likewise, in the same way, if a white person chooses to call idli a gluten-free bread, because that language helps communicate to their audience exactly what this is. Also a fermented dish, much like bread is, except that you use a combination of lactobacteria and yeast to ferment a gluten-free batter into what looks like a piece of bread. Gluten-free bread is a perfectly acceptable description of idli as well. So, just dismissing it as hipster, oh, no, they must learn to call it idli. All of that is just pointless. Veg biryani exists, gluten-free bread, which is idli, also exists, and potato-filled tacos, rice and lentil tacos, which is masala dosa, also exists.
There are these frequent debates of what is, whose right it is and what is being appropriated. Most recently with kanji and kanji and, the variants of that. And communicate what you can. Language has its barriers. And yes, there was a time when you talked about lentil soup and, rice flour cakes and stuff like that. And Indians, the thing is that, okay, those were books being written for an audience which would not know what you meant when you said idli or dal, and you needed to communicate to those people.
No, also, I think, people need to be empathetic about appropriation. I mean, in that they need to be empathetic or be knowledgeable about the source of whatever it is that they are, they're getting inspired by. And I'm not saying that it's okay for some white person in the US to appropriate something from Africa and then suddenly sort of make money with it and without recognizing where it came from. All that is fine. That's all I'm saying is that it's pointless to police language. Language is the symptom. It's not the underlying cause of your problems in society. Language reflects those problems in society. So if anything, right? So you fix the appropriation issue by ensuring that people get credit, right? But saying things like, oh, don't call it this, you are not allowed to call it this, etc. Policing language is just pointless.
But then again, language does have all those things of exclusion. I mean, very simple stuff. I mean, the discussion we had on GP the other day was about just simple use of the words left and right and their various connotations in different times.
Yes.
Dexterous as opposed,
sinister.
Sinister.
Left. Yeah. So opposite of dextral is sinister, right? So that's the
Or just simple. What is right?
Yeah.
And the thing of gosh. La Rive Gauche is the left bank, but Gauche is, clumsy and things like that. Approach the words.
And also, again, as I said, I think, even that language, as I said, comes from a deeper societal thing that you first need to understand. Only then will you stop using. See, if you just tell people stop using this language, that's not going to help. Like, for example, I think there is, I think I've seen this on Twitter as well. There were a couple of Dalit activist groups that kind of talk about commonly used Hindi curse words, which are of caste, which have a caste origin, okay, and that they recommend that people don't use them because some of the terms that we use, sometimes bhangi and many of those other things, are derogatory references to one particular caste profession back in the past, and then clearly, I mean, you should not be using those terms and so on. But you should also understand what it is before you simply being policed to say that don't use it. It doesn't work.
Pariah. Things like that.
Yeah, pariah. Yes.
Okay, which I never even thought about, but discovered only much later in life. And when we were talking about again about usage, the lower castes who had less access to a huge number of things, the people who were the suppressed castes, would, for instance, use every part of an animal because nothing could go to waste.
Yes.
Right? Kirtana, who was one of my first or second guest on this show, was talking about how they moved to a farm, and the person who cooks for them and helps out on the farm and sent across a blood soup, which fortunately didn't go down very well in the family because Kirtana is vegetarian and her daughter is vegan, and so her husband had to consume a lot of that, kind of thing. Which is just the way that you use your ingredients and what would be considered. I mean, again, language, tripe.
Yeah. Exactly.
Things like that. Organ meat was not
Yes.
considered not
Offal.
eatable. Right, offal. Things like that are derogatory, and not just in India and a caste issue, but at other parts
anywhere globally. Yes.
Yeah.
In fact, there was I had this discussion about concept of breakfast, for example. It's actually quite interesting. Upper caste people in India did not have historically the concept of a breakfast. If anything, actually, most texts will tell you that you're not supposed to eat the first thing in the morning because you're supposed to do pujas. Then you eat only after you feed the god, the prasad, naivedyam, and all of that. So there was no concept of breakfast. And it's also not surprising because this is not a group of people who did hard labor. So the only people who hate breakfast before they went out to do hard labor were the oppressed castes. Okay. And so interesting, because if you now look at breakfast food in India, they're all insanely high carbohydrate, highly deep fried items. And they reflect this sort of agricultural past of people who did hard labor would eat a ton of carbs because they need that energy in the field right then. They're not like eating protein or those kinds of things or fat. They're eating carbohydrates because carbohydrates give you energy like now. Okay. So that's why a lot of Indian breakfasts tend to be very, very carb heavy. And because they come from people who used to do agricultural labor, not from people who are sitting and doing pujas at home. So they were not eating breakfast. Now they've adopted it. And now, obviously, now the people who never did labor in their lives are eating 3 meals a day, and then, they're getting diabetes. That's a separate problem altogether. Yeah.
The conversation with a friend about this, again, talking about Punjab and the Punjabi lassi and the thing. And I was like, dude, when your grandfather was putting in those hours in the farm, in blistering heat or in freezing cold, he needed that energy. You're sitting in an office in Gurgaon, right?
Right.
Air-conditioned splendor, not moving your butt off the chair for like 8 hours a day.
Yeah.
That's a recipe then. If you're eating a peasant food that's designed for peasant labor.
Yes.
And doing a sedentary job.
Yes.
Not going to end well.
Yeah. So actually there is in many countries, there is a concept of the farmer's meal. Okay. I remember in Colombia, in Medellin, they have something called the name, some El Paises. It's what the farmers would eat before they go to work in the field. It is easily 2,000 calories. It is just a lot of beans. It's fried bananas. I mean, bananas are a staple in Colombia and Ecuador, right? So raw bananas are very, very big there. And toast, and then sausages, and it's just insanely heavy breakfast. Okay. And again, it is not meant for, now it's hipster. It looks nice. It's Instagram friendly. And so you have like tiny, scrawny young people try ordering it and then taking photos and largely wasting it and so on. But yeah, I mean, this is quite true there as well.
All right. Do we have any more questions? I see that 19 of you are still here. And if you'd like to come on and ask a question, you can just raise your hand and ask it with audio. But so Krish and Ashok, I'm going to ask you a thing. What has the reception been like to the book so far? What kind of feedback are you getting from the various kinds of people that Penguin and you were looking at as your target audiences? And you had intentions of what this book would do for them. We've talked about that. What kind of things you're pretty active on Twitter, you're active now on Instagram as well, you're not on Facebook, I know, but you've got channels open. What are you hitting? What are people telling you about the book?
So clearly, I think it's pleasantly surprised that it's largely been positive, obviously, in the sense that it has continued to be like #1 in the food section for almost 6-7 months now. So which is quite surprising, right? So clearly it seems to have struck a chord with a reasonably diverse set of audiences. So that aside, I think, there's been a small number of people who bought the book and were disappointed that it didn't have recipes. Okay. So there is a small number of people who assume that a food book has to have recipes, and so on. So there is a small amount of people, and so on. And there is also some sort of points about the fact that some of these applying science to everything right? Then people may not have the, it takes the art, it takes the beauty away from cooking and so on. And also, to be fair, and a more fair criticism is actually the one that's saying that most people don't have the time to do it the scientifically correct way and all that. They, as you rightly said, I would rather do by whistles if I have to deal with two screaming kids and all of that than sit and remember all of that. So sometimes the fact that some of the advice can be gratuitous, etc., is also there. But largely, I think it's people have been surprised, and I've also been surprised by the number of chefs who have personally enjoyed the book and have gifted it to tons of people. And in many cases, some of those chefs have told me that this is, look, when people ask me how I do what I do, I'm not able to explain it. But this book has helped me explain what I do better to people, in the sense that I know why what I do is tasty. Okay? And it has helped me explain that better when I teach and so on. So I've had a few sessions for even like people in catering universities and colleges and so on. So that has also been so it's overall, I think it's done really, really well, given the fact that it's a book that came out in the middle of a lockdown and a pandemic in a country where 60% of English book sales happen. And when I say English books, I'm not counting textbooks, like, which are always, and competition success wala category of exam cracking things.
Trade publication.
That is the biggest category of sales. That's like 100x. Okay. Anything other than that, fiction, non-fiction, and all of that, 60% of sales happen in airports. Okay. Mm-hmm. So that's how bad it is. Okay. It's airport bookstores, because that's where people have the disposable income to buy, make impulse purchases of books and so on. But obviously, the first thing that shut down during the pandemic was airports. So essentially, we were just down to only the online channel. And so it's been pleasantly surprising that it is done well. Yeah.
Right. And it is one of the first reactions that I heard from, I won't say who and whatnot, when I heard about the book. I told someone, and they were like, oh God, not another engineering approach to X, right?
Yeah, I know. Tech Bro explains cooking. Tech Bro explains. So that is also there. But I think so, which is why I think. But to be honest, anyone who's read the book fully, the vast majority of them, okay, I think they enjoyed it and so on. So as for shallow, I didn't read the book, but I'm sure what it is, that I normally just ignore.
Mm-hmm. Because you had a question, I do have one more question for Ashok after this, but if you want to turn on microphone, I have permitted you to talk, or would you like me to ask the question for you? Vikas T.
Yeah, I can read the question, so in any case. Yeah.
All right. So I'll read the question for the board, because this is only to panelists. This isn't a food science question, but why is it that despite a wide diaspora of Indians abroad, we only have around 20 to 25 Indian dishes which are well known worldwide? Palak paneer, butter chicken, dosa, idli, lassi, etc. What can be done to grow the popularity of regional Indian food? Or is it a lot of this due to the dominant immigrant population that settles abroad? To which I will add that the people who do settle abroad tend to come from some kind of privilege. Do see caste and community reflected in what Indian dishes are well known abroad as well. So, Ashok, could you take that?
Yeah. So this is, so at least in the context of, it's actually interesting. This aspect of his observation is not just true for Indian food. It's true for Thai food. It's true for Mexican food. It's true for any non-first world cuisine in sense, right? So there is a tendency to pigeonhole into a few things, right? Thai means, kind of red curry, green curry, or a noodle, but when you go to Thailand, there's such a tremendous variety of things. Many of those kinds of dishes you're never going to get in an American restaurant. So it naturally happens for a couple of reasons. One is that a cuisine, as you know, from how restaurants serve it, is fundamentally different from what the cuisine looks like in how people cook it at home. Okay, the diversity of what people cook at home is 100 million times more. Okay, restaurants can only cook dishes that are easy to cook. Okay, they can be taught to a non-native chef. Can use illegal immigrant labor to put together, right? The Indian restaurants in the US use Mexican, sous chefs and so on, or Guatemalan, El Salvadoran, and all that. Okay, So that's one. The second thing is that it has to be easy and it has to be industrializable, meaning that I have to be able to prepare parts of it ahead of time. Nobody cooks anything from scratch in a restaurant. Bear in mind, okay? That you order a dal makhani restaurant, it gets to your table in 10 minutes. No human on the planet can make dal makhani in 10 minutes. You can be rest assured. The gravy has been cooking. The dal has been cooking for 8 hours, and the gravy was cooked that day morning. It's assembled together. They heat some butter, slash it on top, and you think it's perfectly freshly made. So for starters, so it has to be industrializable, meaning that I can do parts of it in ahead of time. Okay, which is incidentally also why you'll never find Maharashtrian style stuffed bindi in a restaurant ever. It's a fantastic dish, but you cannot industrialize it. It is laborious. You cannot automate it. Guy has to sit and cut that bindi precisely. And you have to use your hands to stuff that masala. There is no machine that can do it. Okay. And you cannot do it and keep it because the whole thing will desiccate and dry out because you're adding salt in that masala. So it has to be made fresh, and it takes a minimum of 45 minutes to make it. So any dish like that will never find its way into a restaurant menu. And this is true for all cuisines. Okay. So this is one aspect of this. The second aspect of particularly with Indian food, why only palak paneer, butter chicken, and those are actually it's a more modern day phenomenon. Historically, it's always been butter chicken, palak paneer, and North Indian food because Punjabis were amongst the earliest immigrants for the most part, right? Punjabis have been migrating to Canada, North America, and UK for the last 100 years. And so their cuisine is therefore naturally, from their cuisine, the easy to make dishes are industrializable dishes are the ones that reflect in restaurant cuisine. And over time, once you know that, oh, this is what is Indian food, there's a virtuous cycle where people keep just ordering the same thing, and you think this is what Indian food is. So that also naturally happens, right? Dosa, idli, and all of that is as a result of IT guys, South Indians moving to the US in large numbers since the 1980s and so on. Okay, that is how the growth of the more South Indian style of dishes kind of became popular now. It's, as I said, it's at one, it's that it'll be. I guess also most people outside India also think all Indians are vegetarian. Okay, that's not true. Okay, but this is particularly, the distortion is particularly true for Tamil Nadu. Okay, because mostly it's Tambarams who've been going abroad. People think all Tamil people are vegetarian. Tamil Nadu is one of the most meat-eating states in the country. Okay, and it is one of the largest per capita consumers of poultry anywhere in the world. Okay, Tamil people are insanely crazy about chicken. Chennai is the only city on the planet I'm willing to bet that has more KFCs than McDonald's. Is that fried chicken is just, people are just crazy about it. So, and again, it's on the sea coast, right? So seafood is huge. Okay. So it's just that, again, these are just reflect privilege and access more than actual any reality of a cuisine. Over time, and I think with more diversity, more representation, you'll find niche cuisines starting to open. Actually, if you go to the Bay Area, if you go to New York, you can find lots of sub cuisines. You can find in addition to just Udupi and your Sarona Bhavan and all that, you can find Maharashtrian, you can find all kinds of local litti chokha and all that you can find. Okay, so there is no dearth. There is slowly, I think that awareness will grow as more people migrate as well.
You've also touched on one thing that I did want to talk about and actually forgot at one point, which is the difference between restaurant and home food. And one of the things that happens frequently in the Simple Recipes group is people saying, I ate this thing in that restaurant and I want to know how to, or the cinema theater samosa, right?
Yeah.
The particular thing to it, right? Yeah. Things like that. And yes, there are differences in processes, but it's past midnight, Ashok, and it is a working week for you. I thought we just conclude with Railway Children and why you support Railway Children. If you tell us a little bit about that. Folks, like I say, Table Talk will stay free as long as I can afford to do it free. But what I'm asking all my panelists to do is to tell us about a cause or a donation drive that they support. And we ask everyone who attends that if you can spare the funds, please make a donation as a way of saying thank you to our guest. So I put the link in there, railwaychildren.org.in/donate. You can look them up themselves and find out what they do. But Ashok, why do you support Railway Children?
I think, yeah, so during the second wave of the pandemic, me and a couple of friends, several others, Sidin and others, we used to do these fundraisers. We used to do these clubhouse sessions, weekly sessions, and do them as fundraisers. Tell stories, ask people to contribute, and so on. we kind of came across, we obviously came across several organizations who were doing fantastic work during the second wave, because I think, literally all official state institutions failed around commonly across India, across the spectrum. So clearly, I think the civil society had to stand up, and these kinds of organizations ended up making a huge difference. And obviously, there were tons of organizations that had to deal with the immediate tactical need of just taking care of oxygen supplies and getting people help and medical help and arranging for drugs and ventilators and oxygen and all of that. And there are obviously people dealing with the poverty and access to food and so on and so on. So railway children actually, one of the things that happen when there is large scale tragedy in any society is that the children of the poorest people will regularly be abandoned, in that people simply cannot take care of them. And these children just often have to fend for themselves. They often just sometimes live in railway stations. They beg, because it's a place where there's lots of people. So, they find a way to eke out a survival there. And this is an organization that helps get those children access to food, sometimes access to education, access to sanitary, products and so on. And so it felt like that, so it's one thing to help old people who are, who are suffering from the disease, but this is the next generation, right? The impact that you can have when you help children is that you're saving the future. So in that sense, it felt like something worth supporting. So that's why Railway Children.
Yeah. So folks, if you can, if you have the funds, I know it's not easy for all of us to have spare funds at this point, but if you can, please put in a donation to Railway Children. You can, if you want, you can send me the receipt and I will pass it on to Ashok, and we'll be very grateful for your support on that. But thank you, all of you, for attending, and the 17 of you who have stayed here, an hour and a half or hour and 15 minutes beyond 11 o'clock. Thank you very much for staying. And Ashok, thank you. Thank you so much for making the time to do this. It's been a pleasure.
Good fun.
All right. So at some point, let's chat again about other stuff. But in the meanwhile, thank you. And
hopefully in person.
Absolutely. Yes, we haven't wound up meeting in person yet.
Yeah, we haven't. Yeah, I think, maybe.
All right.
You're based in Mumbai, right, Bashi? Yes, you said.
Yeah,
yes.
I live in Mumbai.
I used to come to Mumbai almost twice a month. Yeah, my head office is there and so on. But then it's airport, South Bombay, then evening back to the airport and back home. So that's all I used to do. So it's a crazy sort of thing.
Anyway,
so I don't think those sorts of things, we'll be doing those sorts of things anymore, right? That kind of ridiculous daily meeting is what I'd probably do a Zoom meeting for in the future, and probably only go when you need to. Yeah.
There's the parts that do have to change, that must change, and I think that we will see now the merit because if things can go on as well as they have in this time, then why not continue doing them? And why not save on all those airplane tickets and all those miles?
No, I think so. It also helps us appreciate the fact that there are many jobs that cannot be done at home. Okay? Yeah. And it's astonishing that every single one of them is underpaid beyond belief. Okay. Every frontline worker is underpaid. Okay. Now, kindergarten school children, daycare workers, nurses, sanitation workers, post office employees. I mean, the list is just endless. Every one of these things is paid a fraction of work that you believed that your office was so important for, that you're simply able to chill at home and do the same thing. And if anything, it should make people reflect that we ought to be paying them more, right? If anything. So I think, lots of things to think about.
Lots of things, yes, lots of stuff. But yes, thank you for making this time on a Sunday. Good luck with the book. And is there a next book, by the way?
I TBD. No, I haven't been thinking about it. So now, just
yeah. So anyway, thank you so much, and good luck with the book. I hope it sells lots of copies. I think it is a book that needs to be read. And good night.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Good night.
Bye. Bye, folks.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Ashok.